Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the soot-streaked heart of a medieval bishop's palace. Not to kneel in prayer or sit in judgment, but to ladle stew and scrub floors. If you've ever romanticized cathedrals or imagined quiet cloisters full of chanting monks and candlelight, well, tonight we'll fix that because we're going behind the walls, straight into the steamy, cramped, clattering domain of the bishop's kitchen. It's 1342. You're not clergy, you're not nobility, you're a kitchen servant. And your prayers? They're mostly about not dropping the bread tray again, so before you drift off, settle into your blankets, maybe turn on a soft fan for some background hum, and dim the lights because your day is about to begin in the very worst way. With the clanging of a brass pan and a voice that's never once whispered, "Welcome to your shift. You slept on straw. Not fresh straw, just straw." Some of it's still clinging to your hair as you blink at the dawn light squeezing between the cracks in the kitchen wall. You lie on a pallet no wider than a coffin lid, hemmed in by two other bodies, both snoring, one drooling. The smell isn't comforting, it's kitchen smell. Grease, old cabbage, wet ash, and the faint whiff of rat. Not that anyone talks about the rats anymore. They're part of the staff. Your bones ache, you're 16 years old but feel 60. You sit up slowly, every joint creaking like the handles of the bishop's wine chest. There's no stretching, no yawning like in storybooks. Just upright, fast, before old Henna notices you're still horizontal. You've already been late once this week, and she's the kind of supervisor who remembers and punishes everything. You tug on your shift. A coarse, half-washed linen thing that itches in new and exciting places each day. Over it, a grease-stained apron that stiffens into shape, no matter how you fold it. Your hands are already rough, cracked at the edges from lye soap and hot water. You haven't even touched the cauldron yet. Outside, the bell tolls, not the church bell, the kitchen bell. Father Emmerich's schedule is set to divine office, but yours is set to porridge. You shuffle to the scullery. It's dim and already warm from the embers someone else managed to stir back to life. The fire never quite goes out, but it certainly sulks. Smoke curls around the low beams. You breathe it in without noticing. You always do. Henna is already there, sleeves rolled up, arms like twisted ropes from 30 years of hauling meat and swatting boys who snuck in for bread scraps. She barks your name before you can speak. Points to a stack of trenchers needing scraping. Bread first, then swill the gruel pot. Yesterday's slop is today's base. No good morning, no blessing, just old bread and older porridge. Your job sounds simple. Cook for the bishop and his court. But it's not cooking, not like anyone imagines it. You don't decide the meals. You don't taste the stew. You barely count as a cook at all. You're a pair of hands in a system that runs on scalding water, grease, and silence. The bishop's meals are dictated by status, fasting rules, feast days, saint days, visiting nobles, and whatever the market failed to deliver on time. And always the demand for more. The kitchen isn't just a room, it's a series of connected punishment zones. There's the boiling corner where cauldrons gurgle and hiss like they know secrets. The butchery block, stained deeper than your conscience. The bread hearth, hot, cracked and moody. And the pantry, your favorite spot only because it's briefly cooler and the mice are friendly. You gather trenchers, the flat, plate-like rounds of stale bread used to serve meat. These will be tossed to the poor later, soaked in fat and guilt. For now, you scrap, dried gravy from their surfaces with a blade worn too dull for real defense. The swill bucket glares at you, Yesterday's gruel hardened into a crust. It'll take boiling water to loosen it, and you know you'll be the one to lift the iron pot. You always are. As you work, the rest of the staff shuffle in. Skinny boys with faces full of soot, a baker's assistant with flour on her nose, and Jory, the meat turner, who once fell asleep on the job and still has the scar on his elbow from a spit-roasted goose. No one speaks loudly. It's too early, too smoky, and too depressing. You wipe your hands on your apron, smear them instead, and start hauling water. You pass the outer corridor, the bishop's hallway, where velvet-robed men walk by with downcast eyes, never seeing you. Your furniture, moving furniture, and not even well-cared-for furniture at that. By mid-morning your arms ache from hauling, and your skin glistens with sweat and kitchen grime. The bishop hasn't even eaten yet. That's the lunch shift. For now, it's boiling barley and thickening yesterday's soup, which has a hint of carrot and a whole lot of mystery. And all the while, Henna's voice keeps snapping across the air. Faster! Not that one! Scrape the mold first. You don't argue, you don't speak unless spoken to. Your job is not to question. Your job is to make it to evening without crying, burning yourself, or earning a cuff behind the ear. As the sun climbs, you glance toward the narrow window slits above the hearth. You're not allowed out until dusk, and even then, only to dump waste or carry scraps to the charity table. You wonder what the bishop eats, really eats. You've never seen his plate come back empty. He's plump, rosy-cheeked with rings that catch the firelight. He gives sermons on humility while sipping imported wine. But you might get a crust, if no one else takes it first. And so the day begins, one splatter, one order, one hiss of fat at a time. And that's just the morning shift. You don't remember when you stopped minding the burns. They're just part of the job now. Tiny red kisses from the boiling pot, raised white lines from lifting the soup kettle too fast, pink patches where hot grease spat from the frying pan. They mark your arms like ink on a scroll, quiet reminders that you belong here in the bishop's kitchen, where even the heat has a hierarchy. The big pot bubbles again and you lean in to stir. The wooden paddle is nearly as tall as you are, stained a permanent brown from hundreds of past meals. It's heavier when the barley sinks low, harder to keep moving when the fat collects around the edge. You scrape the bottom with slow, rhythmic turns, careful not to let it catch. If the stew burns, the entire pot is wasted and the bishop will not go hungry, but someone else will. Guess who? Behind you, the spit groans as Jory turns it. A goose rotates slowly, its skin crackling. The scent fills the air, rich and greasy, sharp with rosemary. Your mouth waters without permission, but you look away. You're not allowed to taste. You're not allowed to ask. Your hunger is a side effect, not a concern. Someone drops a tray behind you. The clatter is loud, but no one flinches. It happens all the time. A bowl shatters and Henna's voice rises sharp as the shards. You'll eat off the floor if you drop another one. She means it. Last week, a scullery girl spilled the cream meant for the bishop's sweetbread. She got no supper and no sympathy. And still, the bishop's guests had their dessert. You step over a dog sleeping by the hearth. It's not anyone's dog, not really, just one of the many who wander in for warmth and scraps. No one feeds them. They take what falls, the same way you learn to. The swill bucket glares at you. Yesterday's gruel hardened into a crust. It'll take boiling water to loosen it, and you know you'll be the one to lift the iron pot. You always are. As you work, the rest of the staff shuffle in. Skinny boys with faces full of soot, a baker's assistant with flour on her nose, and Jory, the meat turner, who once fell asleep on the job and still has the scar on his elbow from a spit-roasted goose. No one speaks loudly. It's too early, too smoky, and too depressing. You wipe your hands on your apron, smear them instead, and start hauling water. You pass the outer corridor. The bishop's lunch prep hits its peak just as the church bells ring for terce. That's when the bishop will be finishing his prayers and expecting his meal. The timing is precise. You carry trays now, stacked with bread, fruit, and warm dishes kept half covered in linen to keep the smoke off. Each tray must be held level, each pace steady. The bishop's steward watches everything. One wobble, one drop of gravy onto the fine, white cloth, and henna will make you scrub it out with sand and spit. You don't go into the bishop's dining room. No kitchen servant is allowed. You pass the trays to a page boy, clean-faced and silent, and he disappears behind the carved oak door. You pause for a breath. A mistake. Henna's behind you already. There's trenches to scrape. Move. So you move. There's no real break. Not even time to sit unless you steal a moment while crouched beside the water buckets. You nibble a crust, chew it down without tasting. It's a rough mix of barley and rye, dense as a stone and twice as dry. Your jaw aches after 2 bites, but it fills the gap, and that's enough. The kitchen doesn't quiet until after the bishop's dining hall does. You hear the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the distant cough of someone trying not to belch in front of clergy. Then comes the clatter of dishes being returned, and you brace for it. Used plates, cold gravy, a bowl with the end of a fish spine stuck in dried sauce. You'll be the one who picks it out, soaks it, wipes it, stacks it. You work beside 2 older women in silence. One lost her husband in the last frost. The other hasn't spoken in a month, not since her son was drafted into the levy and never came back. No one asks. Silence is safer. Talking too much means someone thinks you're not working enough. The sun begins to dip behind the stone edge of the churchyard wall. You catch the gold light through the narrow window and it surprises you. Daylight. You'd nearly forgotten what it looked like not filtered through steam. Henna allows a pause then. Not a rest exactly. More of a gap in shouting. You use it to sit on the wooden step just outside the kitchen door. The cold air slaps your cheeks, but it feels good. Real. You breathe deeply. The scent of the garden reaches you. Onions, herbs, a hint of mint. Not enough to taste. Just enough to tease. You sit there until someone shouts again. Not Henna this time, but one of the steward's boys. He's young, but with the power to order you around. His tabard bears the bishop's crest. You don't look him in the eye. Evening porridge needs to be started, he says, and you nod. You nod a lot in this job, so you haul the barley sack back onto the table, scoop the grain with your hands, rough from scrubbing, and dump it into a pot. Add water, just enough to keep it from drying too fast. Add salt if you're lucky. Add bits of turnip if they haven't spoiled. Then stir. Always stirring. Your fingers ache by now, your feet are damp. The edge of your apron is soaked in something that smells faintly like fish and faintly like regret. You lean on the paddle, not to rest, just to breathe. A bell rings for vespers. You wish you were in the chapel, not for prayer, but for warmth. Stone floors are cold, but at least they're quiet. No steam, no orders, just chanting and candles, but that's not for you. You're a servant in the bishop's kitchen, not a nun, not a scribe, just a nameless helper with a burned wrist and an empty stomach. You scrape, the last of the stew from the cauldron and ladle it into the waiting bowl. Not for you, for the porter. He gets supper, you get leftovers, if there are any. If not, it's another crust of bread and sleep. You wonder sometimes what the bishop thinks about you, if he knows your name, if he's ever been inside the kitchen. You doubt it. The kitchen never sleeps. It dozes maybe, but never fully rests. Even at night, when the last trencher is scraped and the stew pot rinsed with cold water and regret, the coals still glow. The embers hum with the day's labour, a quiet red reminder that tomorrow begins too soon. You lie back down on your straw mat. It has never been comfortable. Your spine finds every lump. Your side brushes the splintered edge of a support beam. Someone nearby is coughing, sharp and wheezy. They turn over, and the rustle of cloth sounds loud in the hush. Another servant mumbles in sleep. You pull the scratchy wool blanket tighter and try not to breathe too deeply. The air is thick with smoke and old meat. You have grown used to it, but that does not make it easier to sleep. The bishop's house is made of stone and wood, but the kitchen is mostly timber. It groans and creaks with every shift of wind. You have wondered once or twice what would happen if a fire broke out. Would anyone save you? Would anyone even remember you were here? Morning creeps in before your eyes can properly close. There is no sunrise ceremony, no birdsong, just a sharp thud. Henna's boot against the bench, wake-up call, medieval style. You sit up, knees cracking. Your fingers are stiff and red. Someone passes you a cup of warm ale. It is barely more than water with a whisper of barley, but it is warm. That is all that matters. Today is market day. That means more food. That means more work. You are sent with a list, not written, of course, you cannot read. Henna recites it twice, slowly, with the tone of someone who expects you to forget everything anyway. Turnips, leeks, and a small wheel of cheese if the steward approves the coin. No apples, too costly, and no plums, unless they look unbruised. You nod until your neck aches. The market is down the hill, just beyond the church walls. It smells stronger than the kitchen, if that is possible. You pass stalls stacked with dried herbs, muddy carrots, live hens stuffed in baskets, and a woman shouting about her cabbages as if they were royal treasures. You want to linger, but you are watched, always watched. The steward's boy has followed you, pretending to examine onions, while his eyes stay on your hands. You trade quickly. A cloth of coin in exchange for a limp bag of vegetables. A short nod to the cheese seller who wraps the wheel in damp cloth and mutters a prayer. You feel the weight in your arms before you feel it in your legs. The bag is heavier than it looks, and your arms are already sore from yesterday. You pass beggars on your way back. One of them coughs wetly. Another holds out a hand. You cannot give them anything. You are not allowed. Besides, you are not far from begging yourself. The only difference is the bishop knows your name when he wants food. Otherwise, you are invisible. Back in the kitchen, the oven is already hot. The bread hearth glows with a reddish light. The flour bin is open. The baker's boy is sweating through his tunic. He nods at you but says nothing. You set the vegetables down and immediately begin peeling. The paring knife is blunt. Your hands are clumsy. A layer of skin peels back with the turnip rind, and you do not flinch. There is no time for bandages. You suck the blood away, wipe your hand on your apron, and keep working. Henna returns. She smells like smoke and boiled bones. Her voice is sharp as ever. You missed the radish cellar, she says. There were no good radishes, you reply. Then you should have picked bad ones, she snaps. You lower your eyes and nod. That is the rule here. Do not explain. Do not argue. Just nod and keep working. You dice the leeks next. Their green tops curl like little scrolls. You think they are beautiful in a small, secret way, but you say nothing. Beauty is not a safe topic in a place where even soup must justify its presence. By mid-morning, the kitchen is full again. The boy with the kind eyes is plucking feathers from a hen. A girl you barely know is scrubbing the floor on hands and knees. Her back is bent like an old bow. You stir the pot once more, barley thickening into something like gruel. Henna tastes it with a long-handled spoon. Her face wrinkles. "More salt," she says. "There is barely any salt left." "Then scrape the bottom of the barrel," she replies. You do. You find a pinch clinging to the edge, white against the wood like frost. It goes into the pot. You stir again. The spoon clinks softly against the side. You wonder what the bishop is doing, whether he is reading, or praying, or napping on a soft bench in the sun. You wonder if he has ever peeled a turnip in his life. The steam curls into your eyes again as the pot hisses and groans, a low complaint that matches the feeling in your shoulders. You stir without looking, one hand on the thick wooden spoon and the other braced against the table's edge. The barley gruel is thick now, laced with bruised turnip and that last pinch of salt. Henna hasn't tasted it again, and you're hoping she won't. It won't be any better, just heavier. Heavier is sometimes good enough. Your back throbs from the long bend over the hearth, and you shift on your feet, careful not to stand fully upright. The first few times you tried that, Henna barked at you to look less proud. Pride has no place in the bishop's kitchen. Neither does curiosity or fatigue, or even the smallest moment of dreaming. All that belongs to people with cleaner clothes and quieter hands, the kind that walk through the outer halls without ever seeing the soot that coats your sleeves or the tiny red mark near your thumb where the pot once kissed too close. Behind you, someone knocks over the bucket of peelings and it spills across the slate floor like a dirty fan. Potato skins, leek ends, something unidentifiable. You hear Henna's shoes clomp against the stone before you hear her voice, and when it comes, it is as bitter as old vinegar. She snaps once, and the apprentice who caused the mess bends at once, cheeks flushed. You keep stirring. That is your best defense now. Movement, focus, avoidance. There is no schedule here, not one you can count on. Everything turns on the bishop's appetite, and whether his guests are early or late, and whether someone remembered to order the fish, or if the eggs were delivered warm enough to avoid suspicion. You stopped trying to predict it long ago. You work until told to stop. You eat when permitted. You sleep when your limbs say enough, and your head drifts before your permission catches up. Outside the window, the light has shifted. You can see a sliver of blue between the chimney smoke and the distant trees. There are birds somewhere, not here, but in some other corner of the world where people rest between meals and do not burn their palms for soup that isn't theirs. You think about them just briefly and then force yourself to stop. Thinking too much gets in the way of remembering what comes next. The tray must be cleaned, the wooden bowls rinsed, the table wiped with damp cloth and ash, the knives counted even though there are only 3 worth using. You're responsible for all of it now, at least until dusk. Henna says she has to check the pantry stock before the steward arrives, which is her excuse for leaving the kitchen for an hour and standing in the sun pretending to count onions. You move from task to task without speaking. The others are the same, quiet, thin, precise, most are your age or younger, but the work has shaved the years off them. One of the girls was 15 last spring, full of stories about a brother who went to the coast and promised to send word. She does not mention him anymore. There has been no word, and she no longer believes in the promise. Now she watches the soup pot like it might bite her and doesn't lift her eyes even when spoken to. A small laugh breaks out in the corner. The baker's boy has flour on his nose and someone made a joke about it. It lasts all of 2 seconds before Henna comes back in and the sound dies like a candle touched to water. She doesn't say anything, just stares. That's enough. Everyone resumes exactly what they were doing. Jokes belong elsewhere. As the fire settles into a quieter heat, the smell of onions drifts upward. Someone has begun chopping. Not you, you're tasked with the delivery. The bishop's personal servant has sent word that supper must arrive precisely at the second bell, no earlier, and not a minute late. You glance at the sun's angle, at the length of the shadows across the floor. You think you have enough time, but only if no one slows you. You ladle the barley and turnip stew into a wooden bowl. It's not steaming hot anymore, but it will do. The crust of bread is heavy, rough, and brown, too deep on one edge. You place it carefully beside the bowl. A wedge of hard cheese joins the tray. Then, a cloth to cover the bowl, and a second cloth beneath it to catch the drips before they reach the bishop's fine linen. You carry it up the narrow stone steps with practiced care. Your arms stay level. Your pace never changes. The kitchen noise fades behind you, and your shoes scuff softly on each worn tread. At the top, the air is cooler, touched with incense and polished wood. You've entered the bishop's world, though you're not meant to be seen in it. A boy opens the door ahead of you. He's younger, smaller, better fed. His tunic is red, lined at the edge with green stitching. He doesn't thank you, he just takes the tray and closes the door with a soft push. You see a glimpse of a silver goblet, a hand ringed with jewels, then nothing. You wait for the sound of dismissal, but none comes. So you turn and make your way back down, slower now, arms empty and heart half full with something you cannot name. Not hope, not envy, something quieter. Something like the echo of a question you forgot how to ask. Back in the kitchen, Henna is kneading dough. Her sleeves are rolled, her elbows white with flour. She barely glances at you. Clean the bowls. You do. The water in the bucket is lukewarm now. The scraps float in oily circles on the surface. You scrub with a rough cloth, dipping and wiping until your fingers wrinkle and your palms sting. One of the bowls slips and knocks your wrist. It leaves a small bruise. You do not cry out. Later, after the dishes are stacked and the fire dies to a flicker, you steal a piece of bread from the edge of the chopping table. It is dry and smells faintly of onions. You chew it slowly, not out of enjoyment, but because it is the last food you'll touch until morning. Your bed is waiting. A pile of straw in the corner near the door. The blanket still smells like smoke. You do not mind. You lie down and stare at the beams above, counting the knots in the wood. One day you will leave, you think. You will walk out with a pack and a coin and a plan. You will work in a shop, or join a caravan, or find a farm where the master does not shout. You have thought this before. Sleep does not come quickly. It hovers, teasing, just beyond reach. You close your eyes and listen to the kitchen as it breathes in darkness. A soft drip from the water barrel. A log creaking in the hearth. A whisper of wind against the shuttered window. Tomorrow will come. Henna will call. The pot will boil. And you will stir. The morning arrives again without asking your permission. You wake with your back pressed into the straw, your face half turned into the rough linen of the pillow that no longer smells of anything but damp wool and long-forgotten soap. The air is cold and still, save for the faint rattle of wind outside the shutters and the occasional sleepy rustle from someone shifting nearby. The kitchen has not quite awakened yet, though the fire is beginning to catch. You can smell the smoke curling up through the hearth, that thick, familiar scent that finds its way into your hair and clothes and skin until it is as much a part of you as your own name. Your eyes feel gritty and your legs ache as you push yourself upright, careful not to disturb the girl curled beside you. Her name is Tefra, and she arrived last month, wide-eyed and shivering, with a thin cloak and a bruised lip she did not talk about. She barely speaks at all now, and you have come to accept her presence like you accept the mice in the corner or the draft under the door. She works hard and eats little, and sleeps with one hand curled beneath her chin like a child who once knew comfort. You rise without a word, pat your apron smooth, and begin the day again. Henna's voice echoes from the far room before you even cross the hearth. She is already awake, already shouting, already halfway through a list of things that have gone wrong, might go wrong, or could one day go wrong if someone like you doesn't do everything just right. Her apron is tied tight, her sleeves pushed to the elbows, and she stands like a soldier, preparing for siege, flour in her hair and a cleaver in her hand. She does not look at you when she orders you to fetch water. She never does anymore. The bucket is heavier than it should be, and your arms protest as you carry it across the courtyard to the cistern. The morning chill bites into your fingers, and the metal rim presses into your palm like a punishment. You do not wear gloves. No one in the kitchen does. Gloves are for merchants and messengers, not for those who spend their lives submerged in water and fire. You lower the bucket slowly, the rope creaking, and listen to the splash below. The sound is hollow and distant. The bucket sways before sinking. You pull it up, your hands burning with effort, and wonder if the bishop has ever once drawn his own water. Back in the kitchen, the stew pot is waiting, half full of yesterday's broth and the smell of turnip that never seems to leave. You pour in the water, stir it with the long-handled spoon, and begin slicing onions. The knife is dull again, and the blade sticks instead of gliding. You press harder, feel the resistance, and then feel the sting as the edge bites your thumb. The cut is small but sharp, and you suck the blood away without making a sound. There is no time for cloth or binding. You wrap the corner of your apron around your finger and keep slicing. Breakfast for the bishop is simple this morning: porridge, honey if there is any left, and bread. The honey is kept in a locked box in the pantry, and Henna has the key. She opens it with a click and spoons out the golden paste as if it were treasure. You watch her hands, thick and strong, moving with the precision of someone who has done this for decades. She says nothing as she locks the box again and hands you the bowl. You take it to the tray, place it beside the porridge, and cover both with a folded cloth. There is no conversation as you carry the tray up the stairs. The house is mostly quiet in the early hours. The bishop's servants speak in hushed voices, and the echo of your footsteps on the stone makes you feel like an intruder. You stop outside the bishop's chamber, knock once, and wait. A boy in a blue tunic opens the door, takes the tray, and closes it again. You glimpse a tapestry on the wall, something gold and red and impossibly clean. Then nothing. You return to the kitchen with empty hands. Henna is barking orders again. Bread must be kneaded, fish cleaned, herbs chopped. The bread is the worst of it. The dough is stiff from yesterday's flour, and your wrists ache from pushing and folding again and again until your arms tremble. You press the heel of your hand into the lump and feel it stretch and resist. It is a small victory when it begins to soften, though you do not smile. You glance at the corner of the table where the knife lies, the one that bit your thumb. The cut is red now, not bleeding but raw. You ignore it. By midday the kitchen is full of heat and steam. The spit roasts turn slowly, the fire crackles, and the smell of meat fills the air. Your stomach growls and you swallow hard. No one eats until the bishop eats. That is the rule. And the bishop is hosting 2 guests today, which means more food, more dishes, more hands needed, more chances to make mistakes. Henna's face is already red with the stress of it. You scrape the trenchers with care, trying not to break them. Bread is too precious to waste. The guests arrive just after the bells ring for none. You hear the voices from the hall, laughter, the clink of boots on stone, the rustle of fine fabric. You do not look up as they pass. You have been taught not to. The bishop walks among them, his voice smooth and deep, and you wonder what he looks like when he smiles. You have never seen it, only heard others describe it, soft and vague, as if it were something rare and not entirely trustworthy. When the meal is done and the trays return, the bowls are mostly empty. A smear of gravy, a rind of cheese, a crust of bread too hard for their liking. You scrape it all into the waste bucket and do not think about how long it has been since you last tasted something warm. Henna hands you a smaller bowl, quieter now, and nods toward the corner. Your supper. You take it and sit on the floor by the hearth, legs curled beneath you, spoon clutched in one hand. The stew is thin but hot, and you savor each bite as though it matters. After supper you clean. You always clean. The pans, the knives, the ladles, the floor where the fish guts fell, the wall where the grease splattered, the long table where the trenchers were laid out in rows like waiting soldiers. You wash everything until your arms ache. Then you wash the basin where you wash the rest. Only then do you sit again beside the fire and close your eyes for a moment. Tefra joins you, silent as always. She sits with her hands tucked under her legs, staring into the embers. You do not speak. There is nothing to say. Tomorrow will be the same. The stew, the bread, the bishop's orders pass down through half-heard whispers and the sharp eyes of the steward's boy. Henna will shout, the spit will turn, the water will scald, and your fingers will bear new blisters to join the old. You lie back down in the straw, wrap the wool around your shoulders, and listen to the wind outside. There are owls in the trees. You heard one once, a soft hoot in the darkness. It had made you pause just for a moment to imagine flying. But that was weeks ago, maybe months. You cannot remember now. Sleep pulls at you slowly, not gentle but insistent. The kind of sleep that does not promise dreams, only silence. You let it come, because there is nothing else to do. You will wake again with the smoke in your nose and the ache in your arms, and you will rise and you will stir and you will obey. You did not notice it at first, but the cold has shifted. It seeps now not just through the cracks in the stone, but into the air itself, a quiet, biting presence that wraps around your fingers even when you are near the hearth. The kitchen fire, once a punishment, now feels like your only protection against the creeping chill that slides down from the high tower windows and curls beneath the door like a whisper. The straw under your mat has frozen at the edges. You woke this morning with your breath misting faintly in front of your face, and your joints stiff as old wood. No one complained. No one ever does. Not when winter comes early, as it sometimes does in this part of the country, dragging a damp, sharp wind with it that smells of far-off snow and smoke that never clears. Henna had already started the fire by the time you stirred. Her voice was quieter this morning, not out of kindness, but out of hoarseness. She has caught something, a cough that rattles in her throat like dry beans in a cup, and she mutters more than barks now. Still, the rhythm of the kitchen does not change. There is bread to knead, and stew to stir, and floors to scrape clean of yesterday's grease and bones. You move slower today. Everyone does. The air makes you clumsy. Your fingers fumble with the kindling. Your shoulders burn when you lift the heavy kettle, and your legs ache from the weight of your own steps. It feels as though the cold has sunk into your bones and made itself at home there, like an unwelcome guest who plans to stay long past supper. Breakfast is simpler now, supplies are dwindling faster than they should, and the steward has begun muttering about how the market will not send fresh produce again until the roads clear. Until then, you are making do. The porridge is thinner, the turnips more bruised, and the bread harder than ever. You chip at the crust with the edge of your spoon and chew until your jaw tires. Still, you eat every crumb. The bishop, of course, continues to eat well. His table does not feel the pinch of weather or the burden of scarcity. He receives honeyed pastries and warm wine, salted meat from the stores kept for feast days, and fine apples that arrived in a merchant's basket wrapped in silk and straw. You know this because you helped carry the basket up the steps. You were not allowed to touch the apples, only to look, briefly, before the steward took the tray and vanished behind the velvet curtain. Tephra coughed in the night. You heard her shift in the dark, pulling the blanket up over her mouth, trying to muffle the sound. This morning her cheeks are flushed in a way that is not warmth, and her eyes shine with the kind of fevered brightness you have seen before in others who were made to work too long in wet shoes or sent to scrub the cold floor before dawn. She says nothing, only nods when you glance at her, and rises to take her place at the chopping block as if her hands are not shaking slightly. You want to tell her to rest, to lean against the hearth until the tremble leaves her limbs, but there is no one to take her place and no rest to offer. So she chops and you stir, and Henna watches from her stool with her cough growing harsher by the hour. By midday, the sky outside is the colour of dull pewter, and the kitchen glows a little more golden than usual, the firelight casting long flickers across the soot-streaked walls. The warmth is welcome, but fleeting. Each time the door opens, the wind slaps the room with icy hands, and everyone flinches. You are sent to fetch water again, and this time the rope burns your hands with frost before you've pulled the bucket halfway. The water smells faintly of ash and iron, and your reflection in it looks older than you remember. When you bend to lift it, your back protests, teeth, and you carry it slower than usual, cradled against your chest like something fragile, though it weighs as much as your silence. The bishop has guests again. The bells ring earlier than expected, and the kitchen turns frantic. You feel it in the way Henna's voice sharpens despite the rasp, in the way the others move faster, more jerky, less precise. Jory drops a ladle and swears under his breath. No one laughs. You lay out trenchers and wipe the wooden bowls, until they shine with a dull, waxy finish. The meat is already roasting. Its scent fills the air with fat and spice, and your stomach clenches in protest. You know you will not taste it. You will taste only what remains, if anything, and even then only if Henna is not watching. You prepare the serving tray again. Bread that is not stale. Butter that was kept wrapped in cloth and buried in cool stone to preserve it. Cheese that smells faintly of herbs, all laid out in careful rows on a linen cloth you scrubbed 2 days ago until your fingers bled. You carry the tray up the stairs, your pace practiced, your hands steady despite the ache. The page boy at the top takes it without looking at you, and the curtain closes once more. The warmth behind that door is different, not just firelight. The kind of warmth that comes from thick wool and full bellies and not having to count your steps or your breaths. When you return to the kitchen, the room is quiet again. The meal is served. The work is paused. Tefra sits beside the hearth, her head lowered, arms wrapped around her knees, her lips are pale. Henna notices but says nothing. You cross the room and sit beside her, offering her your piece of bread from earlier. She shakes her head but takes it anyway. You do not speak. There is no need. There are no words that would make the weight in her limbs disappear or the heat behind her eyes cool. But she leans against your shoulder, just slightly, and the closeness warms something in you that the fire never quite reaches. Later, when the trays return and the scraps are collected, you find a corner of meat still clinging to a bone. It is not much, a bite, maybe 2. You tear it with your teeth slowly, quietly, and chew with your eyes closed. The flavor is sharp, rich, and gone too fast. You want to weep, but you laugh instead, a soft huff into your sleeve. The absurdity of it all, that a scrap from the bishop's plate should feel like a holiday. You wonder if he ever thinks of you, if he ever considers the hands that scrubbed his bowl, or the girl who coughed through the night and still diced his leeks with trembling fingers. Probably not, but sometimes, when you carry the tray and catch the faint scent of his perfume, or glimpse the shine of his rings, you wonder if he has ever known hunger, or cold, or silence that stretches so long it starts to feel like its own language. Night falls early in winter. The sky outside is nearly black by the time the last pot is scrubbed and the fire allowed to die down. You curl into the straw, your knees drawn to your chest, the blanket tucked beneath your chin. Tefra sleeps beside you, her breathing shallow and uneven. Henna coughs again from her corner, and someone mumbles in their sleep. The kitchen grows quiet. The warmth fades slowly, and the cold settles in again, pressing against your skin like a second blanket, colder and less forgiving. You close your eyes and count your breaths, slow and steady, waiting for sleep to carry you away. But before it comes, you think of the bishop's room and the heat that never fades there, and the food that never runs out, and you wonder what it would feel like to be full, not just of stew or bread or scraps, but of rest, of peace, of enough. You knew something was wrong the moment you opened your eyes. The darkness was still holding on to the corners of the kitchen, but it was not just the dark that felt wrong. It was the stillness. It was too quiet, no soft stirring from the straw next to you, no cough from Henna's corner, no creak of the fire being poked into life. You sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from your shoulders, and your skin prickled with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Tefra was beside you, but she was not curled into herself like usual. She was flat, her arms thrown out slightly, her face turned away, and the wool blanket tangled at her knees. You reached over and touched her shoulder. Her skin was hot. Not warm from sleep, but hot, dry and radiating heat, like the hearth after the logs have fallen apart. Her breath was shallow, and her eyes flickered under the lids as if she were chasing something in her dreams or being chased. You called her name, softly at first, then again louder. She stirred, but her mouth moved without sound, and her eyes did not open. You sat beside her, one hand on her forehead, the other clenching the edge of your own blanket as though it could anchor you in a world that had suddenly tilted. You had seen fever before. One of the scullery boys had gone the same way last winter, after a week of soaking his feet in cold water to scrub the flagstones bare. He had worked through it until he collapsed while cleaning the chamber pots, and by the time the steward took notice, he was too far gone. The kitchen had been quieter for a few days after that. No one said his name, just like no one was saying Tefra's now. Henna rose late that morning, and when she saw Tefra, she only muttered under her breath and went to stoke the fire. She had no herbs, no medicine, nothing but broth and boiled cloths, and even those had to wait until after the bishop's brie, K-fast. There was no room for sickness in the kitchen's schedule, no gaps for rest or tenderness. You were handed the list for the market before you had even laced your boots. There were leeks to fetch, barley to weigh, and a wheel of cheese that might be bartered for if you played polite with the seller. You hesitated, looking back at the pallet where Tefra lay, but Henna's eyes were clear, even if her voice still rasped. If you did not go, someone else would be sent, and that someone would not care. So you took the list, tucked it into your sleeve, and walked into the morning fog. The market was quieter in the cold. Fewer voices, fewer stalls open. You walked past a man skinning a rabbit, his hands red with cold, and an old woman stirring a pot of something that smelled like onions and hope. You traded a hunk of hardened cheese from the pantry for 2 bruised apples and 3 onions. Not enough, never enough, but it would have to do. The coin Henna gave you was only enough for barley, and even then, only because the merchant recognized the bishop's seal and gave you a little more out of fear or faith. You returned with your arms aching and your hands raw. The kitchen swallowed you again without question. The rest of the day passed in steam and silence. Henna was quieter now, her coughing heavier, her commands more clipped. She snapped at the stew and then at the girl who sliced the bread too thick. You kept your eyes down and your hands moving. The rhythm of the kitchen did not care for your worry. The pot had to be stirred, the trenchers had to be scraped, the fire had to be fed, and the bread turned, and the trays carried up the stairs on time, warm and perfect, as though no one below was starving or shivering or dreaming of somewhere else. You stole moments when you could. A second by Tefra's side, pressing a cloth to her forehead, whispering her name. She murmured, "Ed back once, your name maybe, or a fragment of it." Her eyes did not open. You left a piece of apple by her hand, peeled and sliced thin. When you returned later, it was still there. At supper, you barely tasted the broth Henna gave you. Your mouth moved around it like it was a task, not a meal. The fire cracked and the spoons clinked, and the sky outside deepened into blue, but your thoughts stayed beside that straw mat and the girl who hadn't smiled in weeks but had once brushed your sleeve with her hand when you gave her your last crust of bread. You remembered that touch more clearly than the taste of your last proper meal. That night you did not sleep easily. The floor seemed harder than usual, the sounds sharper. Someone cried out in their dreams and was hushed. Henna coughed long and deep. The mice in the pantry scratched at the sacks. You lay still, eyes open, counting the stones in the wall. You tried to remember a song your mother once hummed, long ago, when you still lived near trees and had your own blanket and shared your food with a dog that followed you everywhere. You could not remember the melody, just the rhythm of her fingers tapping your shoulder in time with the tune. The next morning, Tephra did not wake. Her breath still moved, but her face was pale now, a waxy sort of pale that you had never seen on the living. Henna's hands hovered over her, uncertain. She muttered something about letting her rest and turned back to the dough. You did not argue. You covered Tephra with an extra layer of cloth and tucked the apple beside her again. This time, you knew it would remain untouched. That day, the bishop's guests included a noblewoman with a white fur collar and a ring that sparkled each time she lifted her cup. You saw her for only a moment through the dining hall door as you handed off the tray. She laughed, bright and clear like chimes in the wind. You wondered what she was laughing at, if it was something kind, if she had ever looked at someone like you and thought anything other than servant. You wondered if she had ever been cold. After supper, Henna let you sit by the fire. She said nothing, just nodded once, and sank onto her stool, her hands red and cracked. You watched the flames rise and fall, casting shadows on the wall. You imagined Tephra standing, walking, laughing again. You imagined her somewhere with real sunlight and clean clothes and food that did not have to be stolen in slices. You imagined yourself there too, just for a moment. Then the flames shifted, and the sound of a pot lid clattering reminded you where you were. You got up and scrubbed the bowls. The next morning arrived not as a brightness, but as a gradual greyness that leaked through the cracks of the shutters like thin smoke. It was the kind of morning that made no promises, the kind that reminded you how the air in the kitchen could feel just as heavy as the water you hauled in buckets. You stirred from your straw bed slowly, your body stiff and your neck sore from the way you'd twisted it in the night, half turned toward Tephra. She was still beside you, still but not sleeping. Her face had taken on that strange, sunken stillness you feared more than you understood. Her breathing was almost soundless, and her skin was now cooler, not quite cold, not yet, but far from warm. You touched her hand lightly, only to find it limp and damp. There was no change, and yet that absence of change was enough to make your chest tighten. About how food was not going to prepare itself and sent you to fetch firewood. That was the way of the kitchen. It didn't stop, not for illness, not for grief, not even for the fear that curled like smoke into your thoughts. You wrapped your cloak tight and stepped out into the courtyard. The frost crunched under your boots, and your breath came out in short bursts that vanished into the still air. The pile of wood was slick with morning damp, and your fingers numbed quickly as you loaded the pile aces into the basket, stacking them tight, hoping each one would catch without fuss. When you returned, Henna was stirring the gruel with one hand while wiping her nose with the other. Her cough had worsened, but she continued as though it were nothing more than a mild irritation. You took the wood to the hearth and fed the fire slowly, watching the flames rise, catching on the older logs first before licking greedily at the newer ones. The light cast long shadows along the walls, stretching across the soot-streaked beams like fingers. You glanced at Tephra again, hoping to see her stir, to hear her cough or even groan, but she did not move. The slice of apple you had left by her side had gone brown, uneaten. The day passed in slow layers. The bishop's household was unusually still, perhaps in reflection of the cold, perhaps because of something else. The steward came down twice, once for a piece of the hard cheese to serve with spiced bread, and again for instructions to prepare a tray of broth for an elderly guest who had taken ill. You wondered if the guest's illness felt anything like Tefra's, if their hands were being held by someone, if their forehead was being dabbed with soft cloth and prayers. You made the broth. It was your task. You added herbs, careful with the measurements, and stirred until it thickened gently, just enough to coat the spoon, but not enough to be called a stew. It smelled of thyme and garlic and something almost like warmth. You placed it carefully on a wooden tray with a slice of the freshest bread and a dish of honey, watching the liquid shift in the bowl with each step you took. As you handed it to the steward, he grunted something you could not catch, his eyes flicking over you without resting. You did not expect thanks. You never did. But something about this silence stung in a new way. When you returned, the kitchen had quieted again. Henna was resting on a stool by the wall, her shoulders hunched, her apron soiled, with flour and ash. You had never seen her sit for so long, without issuing an order. Her eyes were closed, though you could see her lips moving slightly, whispering to herself, or perhaps praying. You did not ask. You placed a kettle on the hearth and sat near the fire, not close enough to be told off for resting, but near enough to warm your fingers. Tefra remained unchanged. Her chest still rose, but only barely. You dipped a cloth into the warm water and pressed it gently to her face, wiping away the dampness at her temples. Her skin was pale now, and her lips cracked, as though the fever had drained not only her strength, but her color, her voice, her very presence. You said her name softly, once, twice, a third time. But the sound disappeared into the quiet, swallowed up by the hum of the hearth and the faint wind outside. That night, Henna allowed you to keep a candle burning beside Tefra. It was a small gesture, perhaps out of guilt, or memory, or simply a need to keep the shadows at bay. You watched the flame flicker long after everyone else had fallen into their restless, shivering sleep. The wax melted slowly, pooling at the base of the stubby holder, and the shadows danced against the walls, like old ghosts revisiting their favorite haunts. You held Tefra's hand as the candle guttered and felt how light her fingers had become, as if she were already part way into another world. You fell asleep like that, sitting against the wall, her hand in yours, your head tilted back against the cold stone. When you woke, the candle had burned out, and the room was darker than you remembered. For a moment you could not tell if Tefra still breathed. You leaned close, heart racing, and then felt the faintest warmth against your cheek. She was still there, still waiting. The morning began with frost again. Henna's cough had turned wet and deep, and she moved more slowly than ever, muttering about needing herbs from the convent garden, and shaking her head when she looked at the stores. There was no meat, the bread was running low, the stew would be thin today, thinner than most days. You did not mind. Hunger felt like background noise now. What mattered was whether Tefra would open her eyes, whether her fingers would tighten around yours, whether she would speak. You fed her broth that afternoon, spoon by spoon. She did not resist. She did not wake, but her lips parted when you pressed the edge to them, and she swallowed slowly. Henna saw and nodded once, just once, before returning to the dough she was kneading. That was all. No praise, no scolding, just acknowledgement. And sometimes that felt like enough. When you lay down that night, Tefra's breathing was steadier, not strong, Not safe, but steadier. You let yourself believe she might last another day. You curled close to her, wrapping your own blanket around you both, and closed your eyes to the sound of rain on the shutters. It had started while you were boiling water, and now it fell in a steady rhythm, soft and sure, like the heartbeat of something larger than all of you. The fire popped once and then fell quiet. You thought of your mother's song again. This time you could almost hum it. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning, not with any particular violence, but with the sort of quiet persistence that seeps into stone and straw alike. By the time you opened your eyes, the straw under your blanket was damp, and the scent of wet earth had found its way into the kitchen itself, settling in corners and soaking the hem of your apron even before your boots touched the floor. The fire was barely more than a sulky glow, the logs having burned down to blackened bones, and no one had risen early enough to stoke it yet. Henna's form was still curled against the hearth wall, her head resting against her folded arms in an awkward slant that made her usually rigid figure seem strangely small. You almost did not recognize her in that position. She had always seemed too solid for weariness, but even her breath was uneven now, broken by the coughs that came in waves before quieting into a heavy silence. You sat up, slowly, your back aching, and looked down to see that Tefra's eyes were open, just slightly, just enough. Not wide and clear, not sharp or questioning, but open. She was looking toward the fire, not quite at it, and her expression was blank, as though she were trying to recall something that remained just out of reach. You did not speak at first. You only reached for her hand, and this time when you touched her fingers, they curled back toward yours. Barely more than a twitch, but real, alive, present. You swallowed hard and smiled. Not a wide smile, but the kind that sits quietly in the chest, steadying. You whispered her name, and she blinked slowly, then once more. The sound of her breath had changed. It was no longer shallow and distant, but closer, less ghostly. A beginning of return. You sat with her while the fire was relit, one hand wrapped around her wrist, the other cradling the bowl of yesterday's broth, now warmed over the small coals. She took a few sips, weak and uncertain, and coughed softly afterward. Her voice had not returned, but her body was no longer slipping downward. Henna stirred by the fire and watched you both with red-rimmed eyes, saying nothing. You could see the grey in her cheeks now. Her cough had deepened into something that rattled with each breath, and she moved more slowly, pausing to rest against the chopping block after only a few steps. She did not shout once that morning, not even when one of the boys broke the handle of the grain scoop and spilled barley across the floor like so many pebbles scattered from a broken pouch. The stew was little more than onion water that day. You chopped the vegetables yourself while Henna sorted herbs with trembling fingers, and the others kept to their tasks with the quiet precision of those who understand that something delicate has entered the room. The steam from the pot filled the space around you, making your eyes sting and your throat feel raw. You leaned over it carefully, breathing in the warmth and letting it chase the dampness from your sleeves. You remembered your mother once saying that onion steam could drive out a fever. You had no idea if that was true, but it felt like a story worth believing. Tefra managed to sit up by the second bell, propped against the wall with folded cloth and your rolled-up apron beneath her back. Her hands still trembled, but she managed a piece of bread, chewing slowly and swallowing with effort. You sat beside her between chores, dabbing her forehead and adjusting the blanket when the shivers came. Her eyes would sometimes drift closed while you spoke, but once when you mentioned the cat who used to sneak into the kitchen from the garden wall, she smiled. Faint and crooked, but unmistakable. That smile held you together for the rest of the day. It made the cold easier to bear and the scoldings less sharp, though there were fewer of those now. Henna barely moved from the hearth that night. She seemed thinner, her voice reduced to a whisper, and her face drawn in lines that had grown deeper since the frost first came. You brought her water without being asked, and tucked an extra cloth under her feet. She grunted softly in thanks, her pride thinned by pain. She did not look you in the eyes, but she did not turn you away either. There was something in her quiet that felt like permission, or surrender, or maybe just weariness, finally too heavy to fight. You ate in silence that night, a bowl of thin stew, a crust of bread you'd warmed over the fire until it softened. Tefra ate too, one slow bite at a time, her breathing easier now, her eyes a little brighter each time she looked toward you. She slept early and without fever. You stayed awake longer, sitting with your back against the cool wall and watching the flickering of the last log in the hearth. The room was darker than usual, the candle stub already used the night before, and the moon hidden behind thick rain clouds. The only light came from the glowing embers, low and orange, like the pulse of some patient creature that lived beneath the stones. You thought again of the bishop's chambers above you, where warm wine likely steamed in silver goblets, and the air did not bite. You imagined the tapestries, the soft rugs, the way the doors shut gently instead of slamming in the wind. You wondered if he even knew Henna's name, if he had ever once asked about the girl who prepared his supper, or the boy who scraped the burned crust from the bottom of the pot. Probably not. The kitchen had always existed in a different world, just beneath his. Close enough to serve him, far enough to remain unseen. Yet it beat with its own rhythm, steady and stubborn, like the coals that refused to die even when the wind blew hardest. The next morning, the rain stopped. The air was still thick with moisture, but the light was different, brighter, less grey. You opened the shutter slightly and saw that the courtyard was filled with puddles that reflected the sky like broken bits of mirror. Tefra sat up on her own that day. Not for long, but long enough to reach for her own cup of water and smile when you brought her stew. You helped her move to the bench by the hearth, wrapping her in an extra cloak and tucking the blanket around her knees. Henna watched from her stool, her face unreadable. She still coughed, but it seemed less sharp than the day before. You returned to your chores with new energy, slicing onions and carrots with a cleaner rhythm, scrubbing the pots with fewer pauses to stretch your back. The ache in your limbs remained, but it was dulled now, as though it had finally accepted its place in your day. The boy who worked the ovens nodded at you once. A small thing, but meaningful. For a moment, the kitchen felt like it was breathing again. And later, when the steward came down asking for supper for 2 guests, you prepared the tray yourself. The bread was warm, the cheese sliced clean, the broth thicker than it had been in weeks. You arranged everything neatly, then wrapped the cloth over the top and walked the stairs without hesitation. At the top, the page took it with the same distracted air as always, but you thought you saw his eyes linger on your face for a half-second longer than usual. Maybe he recognized you this time, or maybe the light just fell differently. Either way, you turned and descended with your head a little higher. When you returned, Tefra was asleep again, her breathing soft and even. Henna was peeling potatoes with slow, steady movements. And for the first time in what felt like months, you felt the kitchen settle into a kind of peace. It was still cold, the food was still poor, the fire would still need stoking again before midnight, but there was a warmth now, faint and flickering, that no rain could wash away. The peace that settled over the kitchen after the rains was thin, like the layer of steam that hovers above a boiling pot just before it overflows. It was there, soft and quiet and fragile, but always on the verge of slipping away. You moved through the day as you always did, arms working, fingers red with cold, and your shoulders weary before the bells of terce had even rung. Yet something within you was lighter, as though the quiet resilience of survival had granted you a sliver of steadiness that you had not felt in weeks. Tefra now sat near the hearth more often than not, bundled in cloth and still too pale, but upright, awake, her eyes following the rhythm of the kitchen, and her hands occasionally brushing yours in that silent way of hers that said more than words ever could. Henna, too, had steadied. She no longer bent double with each cough, though she still worked slower, more thoughtfully, with the air of someone who has recently remembered that her body has limits. Her voice had returned in part, cracked and hoarse but functional, and she no longer shouted unless it was truly needed. You caught her once watching Tefra for longer than necessary, a strange expression on her face that looked like the ghost of regret. She said nothing when she noticed your eyes on hers. But she didn't look away either. That was enough. Something had shifted in her, just as it had in you. Perhaps the cold had softened everyone, worn them thinner, and left behind only what was essential. The days passed, and with them came new patterns. The bishop's orders grew more frequent again, which meant more trays, more hands, more pressure to keep the rhythm from faltering. He had begun entertaining guests from the abbey, and once a merchant from the coast who wore fine rings and asked for mulled wine with figs. You had never seen a fig, but you had stirred the wine with cloves and cinnamon bark, while Henna oversaw the roasting of the small game birds brought in by a local hunter. The scent had filled the kitchen, rich and thick, and for a moment you let yourself imagine what it must feel like to eat something purely for pleasure, not just survival. You imagined sinking your teeth into the soft fruit, warm from the fire, juice running down your wrist. The thought vanished quickly as the steward entered, snapping for the tray, but it lingered faintly after. Would like the scent of smoke on your skin. Tefra began working again, first in small ways, then slowly more. She swept the ash from beneath the hearth and wiped the blades of the smaller knives. Her hands still trembled sometimes and her movements were cautious, but each day she returned more fully to herself. You watched her closely, not from suspicion, but from something like fear. Not fear of her failure, but of what you had nearly lost. There was a silence between you now, not from distance, but from shared memory. The kind of silence that comes only after you've seen someone you love float near the edge of vanishing and return. On one rare afternoon, when the trays had all been sent up and the stew had been left to simmer without supervision, you sat beside her on the bench, elbows touching. The warmth of the fire reached your faces, and the flickering light danced along the pots hung from their hooks. You both stared into the embers for a long while before she finally spoke. Her voice was thinner than you remembered, like wind passing through dry grass, but steady. She told you about a time before the kitchen, a village nestled beside a small river where she used to help her mother wash wool and hang it in the sun. Her father had carved spoons from fallen branches, and her brother used to make her laugh by chasing chickens with a hat over his face. It felt strange to hear her speak so much. You had known her in silence for so long. Her voice felt like something newly woven. You did not tell her about your own before, not yet. It remained tucked inside you, like a letter you were not ready to open. But you nodded and smiled, and when she leaned her head briefly against your shoulder, you let it rest there, your body stilling into the weight of her trust. The kitchen that night smelled of fresh bread. You had been allowed to help knead it, and the warmth of the dough in your hands had felt oddly intimate, like shaping something that could carry memory. You worked the flour into the bubbling yeast and watched it rise slowly, as though it too were unsure of the cold. When the loaves came from the oven, you brushed them with lard and wrapped them in cloth for the bishop's evening board. One loaf, slightly misshapen and smaller than the others, was quietly left aside. Henna didn't mention it, and neither did you. That loaf fed 5 of you before bed, and it was warm enough to draw sighs from those who had forgotten the taste of something made with care. That night you dreamed, not of escape or comfort, but of light. Not a fire or candle, but something vast and golden, like sunlight passing through cloth on a warm morning. You did not know where you were in the dream, but you felt safe there. When you woke, the feeling lingered like a memory just beyond reach. The next morning the frost had lifted. The air still held the breath of winter, but there was something lighter in it, the promise of mud, perhaps, or thawed fields, waiting beyond the stone walls. You opened the shutter early and saw a single bird hop across the courtyard, its feathers puffed and its steps hesitant but sure. It made no sound, but its presence was enough. You turned back into the kitchen with a strange urgency in your step. Tefra smiled at you that morning, not faintly, not in passing, but fully, her eyes crinkling at the edges and her cheeks lifting as though they remembered laughter. You returned the smile, and for a moment the kitchen felt like a place where people could become whole again, not just endure. Henna cleared her throat and pointed to the rising dough. The moment passed, but not before something settled between you all. Not warmth exactly, but understanding, a truce, perhaps, between the work and the weariness, between silence and song. There are some mornings when the quiet feels like a kindness. Not the hush of dread or the breathless pause before another order is barked, but a true softness, the kind that wraps itself around your shoulders like a familiar shawl. This was one of those mornings. You felt it the moment your eyes opened and met the soft flicker of light leaking through the shutter slats. Not the grey heaviness of rain or the bleached cold of frost, but a golden, diluted brightness that hinted at sky, perhaps even sun. Your body still ached in the usual places, hips from the hard straw, knees from crouching, arms from hauling water. But the pain felt less sharp today, more like the dull throb of something healing rather than something fresh. You rose slowly, letting the movement stretch the stiffness from your limbs, and looked to where Tefra still lay, nestled in her blankets. She was breathing easily now, her cheeks no longer ashen, but touched with the faintest blush of returning health. Her mouth twitched as if mid-dream, and you let her sleep a while longer, knowing she had earned it. The fire had burned low again, reduced to a sleepy orange bed of coals, so you knelt and added wood carefully, coaxing it back to life with gentle breath and practiced hands. The heat that followed was like a reward, curling around your fingers, seeping through your sleeves and into your bones. Henna was already awake when you turned. She stood by the kneading table, her hands buried in dough, her face set in its usual unreadable mask. But her movements were steadier now. The tremor that had plagued her last week was gone, or nearly so, and she looked stronger under the morning light. She gave you a brief glance and nodded toward the pile of turnips that needed slicing. No words, but none were needed. The rhythm of work had returned, and in its quiet, demanding way, it brought a strange form of comfort, like knowing where your feet would fall even if you did not know where the road would lead. As you worked, the kitchen filled with its usual symphony, the scrape of knives, the low bubble of the stew pot, the hiss of water hitting hot iron, and the rustle of cloth and footsteps. Yet beneath it all, there was a softness now, an undercurrent of ease that had been missing for too long. The absence of sharp voices, of fearful glances, of illness looming in every corner, gave space for something else to grow. Not joy exactly, but stillness, and in that stillness you felt your own breath ease, felt your shoulders drop just slightly from where they had lived, tight and defensive, for so many weeks. Tephra joined you by the hearth, just before the second bell, her steps slow but steady, her hair tied back in a loose braid that she had managed herself for the first time since falling ill. She carried a small cloth bundle of herbs from the pantry, her fingers curled protectively around it. You smiled at her and she smiled back, and though neither of you spoke, the silence between you was full of warmth. She placed the bundle near the chopping block, ready to be added to the afternoon stew, then sat down beside the fire with her hands tucked into her sleeves, watching the flames as if memorizing their shape. You helped prepare the tarts, rolling out the dough with care, your fingers light and precise. The filling was made from dried apples, soaked overnight in honeyed wine, with a dusting of nutmeg and a handful of crushed walnuts saved from the bishop's private stores. The scent that rose as they baked was enough to make your mouth water, a rich blend of sweetness and spice that reminded you of winters from long ago when your mother would tuck slivers of pear into little pockets of pastry and leave them on the windowsill to cool. That memory came suddenly, uninvited, and left a bowl ache in your chest that was not sorrow exactly, but something close, a longing so deep and familiar that it wrapped itself around your ribs like a vine. The cider, too, was fragrant with cloves and slices of orange peel. You poured it carefully into the heavy ceramic pitchers, steam rising in soft spirals. When it was time, you helped lay the tarts onto polished platters, arranging them in concentric circles, their golden crusts glistening. The tray was carried away without ceremony, but you watched it go with a quiet satisfaction. It had been some time since anything from your hands had been sent to the upper halls as something fine. Tephra, watching from her stool, raised her cup of broth in a silent toast when you returned. You touched your own cup to hers with a grin. It was not cider, and there were no tarts left for the kitchen workers, but the warmth of the moment was enough to satisfy. In another life, perhaps, there would have been music to follow. But here in this stone-walled world, there was only work and the brief joys that slipped between tasks, like sunlight through the slats of a shutter. That evening, the kitchen grew quiet earlier than usual. The trays were returned without incident, the floors were scrubbed, and the fire was stoked just once more before being left to glow. Henna retired early, claiming a headache, and the others followed one by one, until it was only you and Tephra beside the hearth, listening to the soft hiss of wood shifting in the embers. She was the first to speak, her voice low and a little raspy but steady. She asked if you ever dreamed of leaving, not in the way of fantasy, but in the honest, practical tone of someone who was genuinely asking what might be possible. You considered her question carefully before answering. You said that you didn't know, that the idea had come and gone like the tide, sometimes strong, sometimes absent, but always just out of reach. You said that you had stopped thinking about leaving in terms of escape, and started thinking about it in terms of amor est, what it would mean to have a day where your hands didn't hurt and your stomach didn't twist with hunger, what it might be like to sleep without needing to listen for the next command. Tefra nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. And you knew she understood. You both sat like that for a long while, the silence stretching between you, not as something empty, but as something full. Eventually, you leaned back against the wall, and she followed, her shoulder brushing yours. The warmth between you and the hearth was enough to lull your body into stillness, and your eyelids began to flutter. The sounds of the kitchen had faded now, replaced by the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the slow, even breaths of those already asleep. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in many nights, you did not dream of hunger or frost or trays that needed lifting. You dreamed of bread rising in the oven, of sunlight on clean cloth, of laughter that did not have to be hushed. And beside you, Tefra slept too, no longer pale and fading, but present, whole. The peace held longer than you expected, as if the kitchen itself had grown weary of hardship and decided for a time to settle into something gentler. Morning after morning, you woke to a room where breath no longer caught with fear, and the cough that once echoed off the stone had faded into memory. The fire no longer struggled to light, the embers held longer, and your limbs, though still tired, began to move with a surer grace. The rhythm of your body no longer strained under panic, but eased itself into the flow of the day, like a foot slipping into a well-worn boot. There was still work, always work, but in the quieter moments between ladles and kettles, you began to notice the little things again. The way the light shifted over the hearth wall as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The scent of herbs drying in bunches above the door, mingling with the smoke in a way that reminded you of summers long ago. The sound of someone humming under their breath, just loud enough to feel like company, but not so loud as to break the spell of stillness. Tefra had returned fully now. Her cheeks bore color again, not just from the fire, but from the renewed energy in her step, and her eyes held a watchfulness that reminded you of how she had been before the sickness, when she had arrived fresh from her village, with hands too clean and questions she had yet to learn to keep to herself. You worked side by side once more, as if the weeks of fear had never happened, but there was something new in the way you moved together, a kind of unspoken language that passed between you in glances and gestures. When she handed you a pot, she no longer looked to see if you were ready. She knew you would be. And when you passed her the ladle, you didn't need to explain how many scoops. The answer was already waiting in her hands. It felt like a small miracle, this ease, the kind that cannot be taught or planned, only grown. Henna too seemed altered. She had not softened exactly. Her eyes still carried the sharp weight of decades spent in a kitchen that never gave more than it took. But there were moments, fleeting but real, when her voice lost its bark and drifted into something quieter. You saw her once stop beside Tefra, adjust the tie of her apron, and mutter something that made the girl smile. That would never have happened before the illness. Before the stillness. Something in Henna had shifted, not broken, not even bent, but realigned. And though she would never say it aloud, the way her steps slowed when she passed Tefra's corner told you that her heart had been caught off guard by something soft and unfamiliar. One morning, just after prime, the steward entered with an odd request. A new guest had arrived, one of the bishop's distant kin, and would be staying for several days. He was older, fond of cream in his porridge, and particular about the salt in his soup. Henna received the message with a blank face, but you could see her mind already sorting through the necessary adjustments. Cream was a rare thing now, especially in winter, and the kitchen stores held barely enough for the bishop's own table. But Henna simply turned to you and nodded toward the ledger. You opened it and studied the records, cross-checking deliveries from the dairy, and discovered just enough cream set aside for baking, should she choose to repurpose it. No one said the word sacrifice, but you both knew what it meant. Tefra offered to walk to the convent kitchens and ask if they had extra. They sometimes traded milk for bread or broth in lean times, and their cook, Sister Marietta, had a reputation for fairness. Henna hesitated, but agreed, and you helped Tefra bundle up before she stepped out into the courtyard, a basket tucked under her arm. The sky had the pale grey glow of a morning, deciding whether or not to rain, and you watched her go until the door shut behind her. You stood there for a moment longer than necessary, your fingers resting on the cool stone of the sill, then returned to the task of boiling barley for the midday meal. When Tefra returned an hour later, her cheeks were red from the cold, and her fingers curled tightly around a wrapped bundle. She'd succeeded, though it had cost the promise of 3 loaves in exchange, to be delivered over the next 3 days. Henna grunted her approval and took the cream without a word, but you saw the way she set it down with careful hands. The guest's porridge was made richer than anything you'd tasted in months, a smooth, pale dish with a bit of crushed honeycomb stirred through. As the tray was prepared, Henna gave the finishing touch herself, sprinkling a pinch of cinnamon atop the cream. It was not gratitude, but it was pride. And perhaps that was the nearest thing to kindness she knew how to offer. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm: the cleaning, the peeling, the stoking, the constant drone of effort that had become the heartbeat of your days. But beneath it, you could feel a quiet shift, a sense that something was being rebuilt, or perhaps simply uncovered. The trust between hands that had worked side by side through fire and frost. The ease of routine made sacred through repetition. And in the corner by the hearth, Tefra sat for a moment on the bench with her feet curled beneath her, mending a torn cloth, with careful stitches that reminded you of home. Not your first home, not the one with the orchard and the laughter, but the kind of home you had learned to make for yourself, wherever you could. That evening, long after the trays had been returned and the fire reduced to glowing coals, you sat beside Tefra again, your legs tucked beneath your skirt and your hands wrapped around a warm cup of broth. She leaned her head lightly against your shoulder and asked if you remembered what day it was. You blinked, startled. You had not thought about days in some time. Time in the kitchen did not move in weeks or months. It moved in meals, in bells, in the changing of light against the hearth wall. But now that she asked, you realized that yes, it was the solstice, the longest night. A night your mother used to mark with songs, with stories told beside the fire, and bits of sugared bread saved from the harvest feast. You told Tefra this, quietly, your voice low and hesitant, as though unsure if the memory still belonged to you. She smiled and asked you to sing one of the songs. You hesitated. Your voice was not meant for music, worn thin by smoke and silence. But she looked at you with those firelit eyes, and you found yourself humming the tune, the words rising like embers, slow and unsure, then stronger. The melody was simple, a lullaby more than a carol, and you did not know all the verses. But it did not matter. She joined you by the second refrain, her voice even softer than yours, and together you filled the kitchen with a sound that did not belong to orders or obligation or hunger, just sound, just song. When the last note faded into the walls, you both sat there a while longer, not speaking, not needing to. The fire crackled softly, the wind whispered against the shutters, and for a moment the kitchen felt like something more than just a place where work was done. It felt like a place where something had survived, not triumphantly, not loudly, but quietly, and that in its own way was enough. The next morning brought snow. Not the kind that vanished before it touched the stones or melted into slush underfoot, but true snow, thick and deliberate and slow. You noticed it first in the hush. The kitchen always carried sound, even in its sleep. Someone's breath, the creak of a board, the soft stir of a restless sleeper. But that morning, before the fire crackled, before Henna's voice rasped through the quiet, there was a softness outside that felt almost sacred. You opened the shutter a sliver and watched the flakes fall steady and silent, coating the courtyard in a layer so clean it looked like parchment before the first word is written. Tefra stirred beside you, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders before she reached for the kettle already placed near the coals the night before. It had become a habit, this quiet morning tea, more ritual than necessity. You passed her the cup, warm between your palms, and watched her take that first sip, eyes still heavy with sleep. She no longer needed your help to rise, to wash, to find her place among the day's demands. But the space you shared remained, neither one of you seeking to fill it with more than it needed to hold. That morning the fire caught quickly, licking at the logs with a satisfying snap, and the warmth chased the chill from your ankles as you began to move. Henna entered slower than usual, her scarf wrapped twice around her neck, her fingers stiff from the cold that had crept in overnight. Her first words were not commands, but a muttered observation about the snow, how it was early this year, how it would make the deliveries more difficult. You handed her the ledger before she could ask, and she studied it with a grunt, tapping her finger beside the barley count. She asked if you thought the grain would hold through next week. You said yes, if the mice hadn't found the back sacks. She nodded. Without meeting your eyes, and moved to the chopping board. That was her way of saying she trusted your judgment. The stew would be thicker that day, out of necessity, more than generosity. Snow always changed the appetite of the kitchen. Cold required more than broth and bread. It needed substance. Tefra set to work peeling turnips while you sliced the smoked meat that had been strung up near the rafters weeks ago, preserved with salt and prayers. The scent was sharp, earthy, familiar. It clung to your fingers even after you rinsed them, a reminder of hunger held at bay. Outside, the courtyard disappeared beneath a blanket of white, and the sky remained a low ceiling of grey. The scullery boy who carried water returned, soaked through, his boots clumped with snow, his knuckles red. Henna handed him a dry cloth without speaking and pressed a hot stone into his hands before sending him back out. You watched her do it, watched the way she paused first, glanced toward the fire, considered. There had been a time when she would not have bothered. A time when the work mattered more than the hands that did it. But perhaps time had worn her too, softened her in places that no longer showed on her face, but revealed themselves in small moments. By midday, the snow still fell, slower now but steady. The bishop's household remained quiet, many of them choosing to remain in their chambers rather than brave the cold for chapel or council. That meant fewer trays, less movement, a rare stillness that settled over the lower floors like a held breath. You and Tefra cleaned the pantry together, reorganizing jars of dried herbs, checking the cloth-wrapped wheels of cheese, brushing away the beginnings of frost that had crept in from the outer walls. She spoke as she worked, telling you about her dreams lately, how they had shifted, how she no longer dreamed of drowning or falling, but of walking through fields she couldn't name, her hands full of bread that never ran out. You listened as you lined up the jars, her voice like the familiar hum of the fire behind you. Later, you both stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching the snow gather on the eaves and pool in the spaces between stones. The courtyard looked transformed, not a place of labor and footsteps, but a new world, untouched, as though waiting to be claimed by someone braver than you. You thought of stepping into it, of leaving footprints across that clean, white canvas. But something held you back, not fear, not duty exactly, but the sense that it was not yet time. Instead, you closed the door gently and returned to the warmth inside. That night, the stew was shared among all with a second ladle. Henna said nothing about it, but you noticed the way she watched the pot as it emptied, not with concern, but with a certain satisfaction. You took your bowl to the fire, sat with Tefra, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. The warmth seeped into your chest and stayed there. Around you the others spoke softly, laughter stirring from the corners like steam rising off a kettle. You leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, and listened. The room was dim now, lit only by firelight and a single candle, but it felt brighter than it had in weeks. Tefra touched your arm once, lightly, and said, "Thank you." You asked for what, and she shrugged. "Just thank you." You didn't press her. Some words didn't need explanation. They simply needed to be said. Before bed, you placed another log on the fire and watched it catch. The flames rose with a quiet whoosh, sending shadows dancing along the walls. You stood there for a while, arms crossed, letting the heat chase away the last of the day's chill. You thought again of the snow, of how it covered everything but didn't erase it. The stones beneath were still there. The cracks in the walls remained. The cold didn't vanish, it only softened at the edges, just like grief, just like memory. As you lay down that night, your blanket pulled tight and your body curled toward the fire, you felt Tefra shift beside you. Her breath was steady, her fingers just brushing yours. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and slow, wrapping the world in its temporary peace. And in that quiet, you let your eyes drift closed, knowing the morning would come, whether you were ready or not. But for now, there was warmth. There was breath. There was the soft promise of another day. And sometimes, that was enough. The snow held through the next day, and the day after that, settling not just on rooftops and windowsills, but into the very rhythm of life within the bishop's kitchen. Footsteps grew quieter. Voices softened without needing to. Even the clatter of pots and scrape of ladles carried a muffled tone, as though the weight of white outside had pressed in just enough to dampen the daily noise. You rose earlier than usual that morning, awoken not by hunger or command, but by the stillness itself. The fire had died down, leaving only a pale orange memory glowing in the belly of the hearth. You moved carefully so as not to wake Tefra, and reached for the logs, stacking them with practiced hands. The warmth returned slowly, licking at your knuckles as you sat back and breathed in the scent of singed wood and ash. Henna arrived shortly after you had lit the lanterns, her boots dusted with new snow and her scarf wrapped tightly across her face. She did not speak immediately, instead stood by the hearth with her hands extended toward the fire, letting the warmth unknot the stiffness in her joints. When she finally looked at you, it was with a curious expression, one that suggested she had been watching you longer than you realized. She commented on the way the fire had been built, quietly, with a nod of approval so brief you might have missed it had you not been looking directly at her. You nodded back and returned to dough you'd begun kneading, the flour cold beneath your fingers, the smell of yeast rising into the air with a hint of something clean and sharp. The bread was for the bishop's midday meal, but you had taken extra care with it regardless. You shaped the loaves precisely, making sure the seams were tucked beneath and the tops smooth. Tefra joined you soon after, her braid already tied and her sleeves rolled back. She smiled when she saw the work in progress, her hands reaching instinctively for the second bowl to knead the next batch. It had become something of a shared language between you, the way you worked beside one another without question, without needing to speak. You knew her rhythm now, the pressure of her palms, the speed of her movements. It was like learning a new dialect and then realizing it had always been there, waiting. Henna watched from her usual corner, a mug of broth in her hand, her eyes following your progress with a look that was neither critical nor indulgent, but something more like guarded admiration. You had stopped trying to impress her weeks ago, but you had noticed lately that she lingered longer during these moments, that she offered less correction. Perhaps something in her had begun to understand that obedience was not the same as care, and that care was not something easily demanded. The loaves rose slowly, warmth from the hearth coaxing them upward while the snow tapped gently against the windows. The rest of the kitchen came to life around you, each worker moving in their practiced orbit, and yet the air felt different. Even the steward, when he appeared to collect the bishop's meal list, seemed softened by the hush outside. He read the parchment more slowly than usual, as if reluctant to break the quiet with his voice. He glanced over the loaves as they cooled and commented, offhandedly, that the bishop preferred the crust lighter. Henna made no reply, simply placed the first loaf aside and reached for the second. That afternoon, with the snow still falling in soft unhurry, IT flakes, you were sent to the Abbey Gardens to gather dried rosemary and sage. The convent kitchen, smaller and dimmer than your own, smelled of wax and stone, and a touch of something herbal that lingered on the edge of familiarity. Sister Marietta greeted you with her usual brisk warmth, her hands covered in flour, her eyes sharp behind her veil. She handed you the herbs and asked after Henna, her tone suggesting a history that neither of them ever spoke aloud. You replied simply that Henna was well enough, still grumbling, still standing. Sister Marietta gave a soft hum and handed you an extra bundle of thyme without explanation. You tucked it into your coat and stepped back out into the snow, the quiet pressing in again like a blanket pulled up to your chin. The walk back was slow, the paths slick and the air sharp against your cheeks. You breathed through your scarf, each step a small effort, but you didn't mind. There was a strange sort of peace in trudging through untouched snow, watching your footprints appear behind you, neat and solitary. You passed no one. The village beyond the walls had gone still, shutters drawn tight, smoke curling from chimneys like sighs. By the time you returned, the light had shifted toward afternoon, and the kitchen had grown warmer, filled with the scent of roasted root vegetables and broth thickening on the stove. Tefra met you at the door, her hands dusted with flour, her smile quick and familiar. She took the herbs from your basket and set them on the table without question, immediately beginning to sort and crush them. You joined her, pressing the leaves between your fingers, releasing their scent into the air. The stew would be better for it. More than better. It would feel like something remembered, like a dish from before. That evening, the bishop requested the hearth tray, a rare occurrence. It meant food not just delivered, but served before him in the great hall, a practice usually reserved for feast days or visiting nobles. Henna insisted that the tray be perfect. She assigned the plating to you and Tefra, instructing you on the balance of color, the placement of meat, the neatness of the bread slices. You worked with precision, and when the tray was lifted at last, you both stood back and exhaled, as if from a held breath. The rest of the night passed quietly, the fire drawing you all nearer as the cold deepened outside. You sat close with Tefra again, the two of you sharing the end crust from a spare loaf, dipping it into a cup of broth that had gone too salty. Neither of you minded. You ate slowly, your shoulders touching, and watched the fire settle into its own rhythm. Around you, others did the same. No one speaking much, no one needing to. The snow still fell, steady and without rush. And for a while, it felt like the world had paused just for you. Before sleep, you lay back on your pallet and watched the shadows on the ceiling shift with the flicker of the fire. You listened to the quiet, to the sound of breath and wood, and winter pressing in gently. There had been days when you did not think you would reach this kind of peace again, when even the act of standing felt like a rebellion against the weight of the world. But now, here, in this moment, you felt the slow rise of something deeper than relief. Not joy, exactly, but something close to belonging. And in that belonging, you allowed yourself to drift, not as someone fleeing exhaustion, but as someone being gently pulled toward rest. The snow did not lift, not even by morning. It deepened instead, quiet and patient, layering itself over the world with a kind of silent determination. You awoke with your back to the hearth, and your fingers curled in the folds of your blanket, the heat from the fire reduced to a mere whisper that brushed the soles of your feet. Tefra was already up, kneeling near the coals with a strip of flint and a shard of steel, her brows furrowed in concentration as she struck again and again until the smallest ember caught. She looked back once she felt your gaze, her eyes bright even in the dim light, and gave you the smallest of smiles before turning back to coax the fire back into life. You watched her in silence for a moment, not because the task was new or remarkable, but because it had once been beyond her reach. It was easy to forget how close she had come to slipping away. Now she moved like someone who had bargained her way back into her body and meant to keep it this time. Henna entered. Not long after, her usual grumble softened into a dry cough that echoed off the stone walls before fading. She said nothing as she passed the hearth, but lingered a moment to warm her hands, her eyes flicking over Tefra with a faint, unreadable expression. Then she went to the basin, splashed her face with water drawn from the nearly frozen bucket, and began slicing onions with a steadiness that made it clear the day had begun. You sat up, stretched your legs until the joints cracked, and pulled yourself into the rhythm without a word. The others arrived one by one, shoulders hunched against the cold, scarves still trailing snowflakes, the kitchen slowly swelling back into life with every footstep, every rustle, every sigh. The snow made everything slower, heavier. The deliveries were late, the firewood damp, the light in the windows lingered in grey rather than gold. You had learned by now that snow wasn't just weather, it was a presence, something that pressed itself into every fold of cloth, every bowl of water, every breath you took. It demanded more of you without ever speaking, and you met it with whatever stubbornness you had left. That morning you chopped roots for stew, your fingers stiff and pink, the knife slipping twice and nicking your thumb, though not enough to draw blood. You worked beside Tefra again, the two of you moving in your familiar rhythm, her quiet questions timed perfectly between your turns of the cutting board. Around midday, Henna pulled you aside. Her voice was low, scratchy from the cold and the morning's steam, and she handed you a bundle of keys wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The steward had asked her to inventory the dry stores, and she needed someone to help count the sealed jars and salted barrels in the cellar. She chose you without much explanation, but her gaze lingered long enough to let you know it wasn't out of convenience. She trusted you. That thought stayed with you as you followed her down the narrow stairs, your boots sliding slightly on the frosted edges of each stone step. The cellar was dark and smelled of oil and old rye, the walls lined with shelves heavy with dried goods, their outlines soft with dust and the damp of age. You lit a small lantern, shielding it with your hand as Henna began calling out items, each one followed by the rustle of parchment as you marked the numbers. You moved slowly through rows of barley, lentils, smoked fish, and blocks of aged cheese wrapped in wax cloth. There were jars you hadn't seen in years, preserved cherries, blackberries suspended in syrup, a whole jar of dried plums no one had touched in months. Henna grunted when she saw it, muttering that it had been tucked too far back, that she'd need to remember it come feast week. You made note of it and followed her deeper into the shadows, where the walls grew colder and the air smelled of damp stone and thyme. Halfway through the count, the lantern flickered and died, the oil inside spent. You stood in sudden darkness, the absence of light so complete it felt like cloth over your eyes. Henna swore under her breath and fumbled for the flint, but her hands, stiff with age, dropped it twice. You reached out instinctively and found her arm in the dark. She passed you the pouch without a word, and you crouched near the wall, feeling for the stones that would catch the spark. It took 3 strikes, but when the flame caught again, you felt a strange warmth flood your chest. Not from the fire, but from the way Henna exhaled beside you, quietly, as though relieved not just by the light, but by the fact that it had been you who restored it. You finished the count with less hurry now, moving deliberately from jar to sack, your voice steady as you read each label, Henna nodding in reply. When you climbed the stairs again, the kitchen felt warmer, louder. The bread had come out of the oven, golden and fragrant, and Tefra was ladling stew into wide wooden bowls with a focus that made her look older somehow. You returned the keys to Henna, who tucked them away without comment, and then took your place beside the hearth, your fingers red from cold but steady. That evening, after the final tray had been lifted and the pots scrubbed clean, the kitchen emptied slowly, the workers drifting off one by one. You and Tefra lingered, as had become your habit. The fire was still strong, its heat welcome, and the snow outside had begun to fall harder, thick flakes clinging to the windows like feathers caught mid-flight. Tefra had saved 2 crusts from the bread and warmed them in the coals, handing one to you without a word. You ate slowly, the crust hard but the warmth spreading through your chest, and for a while neither of you spoke. The silence was full, not empty. You watched the fire settle into its glowing rhythm and let the stillness wrap itself around your shoulders like another blanket. Eventually, Tefra broke the silence. She asked if you'd ever thought of leaving, not out of longing, but as a curiosity, as if the thought itself had become a shape she was trying to understand. You didn't answer right away. You stared at the flames and let the question turn in your mind, feeling the way it moved through you. You said that sometimes you thought of it like a door that didn't open, something painted onto the wall of your mind, always there, always unreachable. Other times, it wasn't a door at all, but a window, just enough to let you see what lay beyond, but not wide enough to pass through. Tefra nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the fire. She said she sometimes imagined a field, wide and golden, where no one asked anything of her, where the work was hers to choose. You looked at her then, really looked. At the curve of her jaw, the line of her wrist, the way her eyes softened in the firelight. You said that maybe leaving didn't have to mean walking away. Maybe it could mean finding that field inside the work. Maybe it was in the bread, in the herbs, in the way you reached for each other when no one else saw. Maybe in a playtime where so little belonged to you, you could still carve out something that was yours. She smiled at that, slow and quiet, and leaned her head against your shoulder. You stayed like that for a long time, the fire slowly dimming, the snow outside still falling, still steady, still patient. And when you finally moved to your blanket, curling once more beneath the familiar weight of cloth and shared warmth, you carried that thought with you, tucking it beneath your ribs like a secret. The morning after their quiet talk, you stirred earlier than usual. The warmth from the hearth had receded into memory, and the bite in the air pressed against your cheeks before you'd even opened your eyes fully. Tefra was still asleep, her breath slow and steady, her fingers curled around the edge of her blanket as though she feared it might slip away if she didn't hold on. You sat up slowly, your joints stiff from the cold and the straw mat beneath you, but the ache was familiar now, no longer something to fear. Outside, the snow continued to fall, fine and endless, wrapping the world in quiet. The walls of the kitchen seemed closer in this pale light, the edges of everything softened by the frost that clung to the mortar between stones and the soot that stained the corners where firelight rarely reached. You lit the fire with care, feeding it the thinner splinters first, coaxing the flame with patient breath. The glow spread steadily, and as the warmth bloomed, it reached toward you like a familiar hand. You had learned to love the fire in ways you had never expected. It had become more than warmth. It was witness and anchor, the steady breath at the center of the kitchen's body. When Henna entered, she didn't comment on your early start, merely offered a nod and set a bucket of onions on the table with a thud that broke the silence. Her eyes were heavy, not with sleep, but with thoughts you weren't meant to know. She moved more slowly that morning, her shoulders stiffer, her steps careful. You watched her for a moment before retrieving your apron, knowing she would never ask for help, but would not refuse it either. As the rest of the workers filtered in, the kitchen swelled with steam and motion. A large pot was set to boil, its lid trembling from the simmer beneath, and the scent of garlic and dried beans began to curl into the rafters. The bishop's steward arrived just after the third bell, carrying a list that made Henna grimace. A visiting monk from the southern priory had arrived during the night, bringing with him a preference for soft foods and strange teas. The monk, the steward informed them without much sympathy, was ill-tempered, suffering from gout, and required gentle meals prepared with care. Henna said nothing but tapped the table with her finger once before nodding toward you and Tefra. You were to prepare the monk's midday bowl. It was the first time she had given such a task to both of you without supervision, and the weight of it settled on your shoulders, like a cloak you hadn't realized you were already wearing. You and Tefra looked at one another, not with fear, but with the quiet determination that had become second nature. She began sorting tea. Aru the herb bundles while you fetched the soft grains and soaked root vegetables, and together you worked in a bubble of concentration that made the world beyond the kitchen door vanish. The knife moved smoothly in your hand, slicing turnips into thin, almost translucent pieces, while Tefra crushed thyme and rosemary together, the fragrance lifting into the air like something remembered from childhood. You boiled the roots until they were soft enough to press with a spoon, then stirred in the herbs and barley, letting the mixture thicken as it simmered. A touch of honey, just enough to soften the bitterness, and a dash of vinegar from the earthen jar near the hearth. Tefra tasted it first, her eyes closing for a moment, and then nodded. Handing you a spoon, without a word, you tasted it too, and for a moment, neither of you said anything. It was simple, yes, but it was also full. Full of warmth, of steadiness, of care. It was a dish, not born of luxury, but of attention, and it felt right. When the tray was lifted and carried out by the younger boy, whose name you still did not know, you and Tefra stood there in the steam-filled quiet, your hands empty, but your hearts somehow fuller than they had been at dawn. The rest of the day passed in the shadow of that small success. Henna did not praise you, of course. She simply moved to the pot and scraped the bottom with a spoon, gave a small grunt of approval, and passed by without comment. But when the steward returned in the evening to report that the monk had finished every bite and requested the same for supper, Henna said your names aloud. Just once, but clearly. You felt the sound of it settle in your chest like something placed on a shelf to be kept. That night, the kitchen emptied again, each worker slipping off to their blankets, their silence no longer laced with exhaustion, but with something calmer. The fire crackled with low, steady breath, and you and Tefra lingered by its glow, as had become your quiet tradition. She sat cross-legged beside you, her fingers curled around a cup of warm broth, and the silence between you was easy, like water flowing over smooth stones. She told you a story then, soft and slow, about her brother and a game they used to play in the fields with sticks and pebbles, pretending to build castles and kingdoms where no one could ever be sent away. You listened with your eyes half closed, letting the sound of her voice wrap around you like the scent of fresh bread. When her voice faded, you leaned your head back against the wall and spoke of your mother's hands. How they had always smelled of soap and soil, how they had moved with a grace you had only come to understand after losing them. You spoke of mornings when you had helped her peel apples by the window, the skins curling into long, perfect spirals, and how she had always managed to save one for you, no matter how many mouths she had to feed. Tefra listened as you had listened, her gaze never leaving your face, and when you fell quiet again, she reached out and rested her hand lightly over yours. The fire dipped low. The snow outside tapped at the shutter like a memory trying to get in. And the kitchen, still so full of echoes and smoke, felt for the first time like something more than a place to labor. It felt like a place that remembered laughter and loss and the shape of hands pressed into dough. It remembered stories, not just the kind told aloud, but the kind held in the curve of a spoon, in the grain of a wooden bowl, in the soft hum of breath before sleep. You did not move for a long time. And when you did, it was only to stir the fire once more, to place one last log gently into the center, and watch as the flames curled around it. You whispered goodnight, not to anyone in particular, but to the kitchen itself, to the walls that had held your sorrow and your strength, to the stone floor that had felt your footsteps again and again. Tephra followed you to your pallet, her steps soft, and as she lay beside you, her shoulder brushing yours, you felt something unspoken settle between you. Tomorrow would come with its own weight. There would be more snow, more trays, more endless pots to scrub. But for now, in the flickering dark, there was warmth. There was the memory of a dish made right. There was the hush of snow outside and the breath of the fire within. And there was the quiet, steady knowledge that you were still here, still waking, still choosing to rise. By the time morning returned, the snow had begun to tire of its own insistence. The flakes still fell, but less urgently now, drifting more than descending, as though even winter had grown weary. You awoke to a softer light, a kind of gentle grey that filtered through the shutter cracks and pressed quietly against your eyelids before you opened them. Tephra was already stirring the pot by the hearth, the hem of her dress brushing the floor as she moved. Her silhouette was framed by the firelight, her posture calm, her motion practiced. You lay still a moment longer, watching her from beneath your blanket, listening to the familiar wooden creak of the spoon as it circled the pot's edge. The scent of lentils filled the room, earthy and mild, laced with thyme from the bundle you had both dried and hung together weeks ago. It felt like a kind of comfort you hadn't known you missed. You rose slowly, stretching each limb until the stiffness gave way to a softer ache. The fire had already been fed, the coals red and steady beneath the logs, and the warmth of it crept up your arms as you moved closer. Tephra greeted you with a quiet nod, her lips curved in a faint smile, not wide or eager, but honest. You took the ladle from her hand without speaking, and she sat back with a quiet sigh, letting the steam rise between you as if it carried everything unspoken. Henna appeared not long after, her cloak still dusted with snow, though her boots were free of it, as though she had stood just long enough outside to shake it away before entering. She said nothing of the weather, but her brow lifted slightly at the sight of the already bubbling pot. That was the only acknowledgement you would get, and it was enough. The day passed without sharp edges. There were trays to fill, yes, and floors to scrub, and barrels to shift in the lower storage, but the work moved with a steady rhythm that felt manageable. The snow had delayed another delivery from the village, so the bread would be thinner today, the stew stretched with water and patience. But no one complained, not even the steward, who had begun to step more lightly when he entered, as though he had finally come to understand the difference between command and disturbance. Henna pulled him aside once, voice low and firm, and whatever she said must have stayed with him, because when he returned later, it was with a basket of dried apples and a muttered apology for the oversight. You and Tephra took the apples to the back room and began slicing them into thin pieces, the blades glinting dully in the pale light from the high window. The slices fell into the bowl with soft thuds, their skin curling slightly as they dried in the warmth. You didn't speak much, but you worked close, your arms occasionally brushing, our breath visible in the air between you. Once she paused, held up a perfect ring of apple and placed it gently on your nose like a child might, and for the briefest moment you both laughed, quiet, breathless, unexpected. It didn't last more than a few seconds, but the echo of it lingered, soft as snow melt trickling through stone. Later, as the meal trays were carried upstairs and the clatter of bowls gave way to the hush of evening, Henna called your name. Not sharply, not angrily, just your name like a thought, spoken aloud. She handed you a small satchel of dried herbs and a note written in a hand you did not recognize. One of the bishop's lesser aides had taken ill, and the physician was requesting broth steeped with these herbs, along with a list of foods the aide might tolerate. It was an odd request to send to the kitchen, not the infirmary, but Henna said nothing as she passed it to you, just gave you that look again, the one that was no longer quite as guarded. You and Tefra set to it with quiet urgency, crushing the herbs first, warming the broth gently over the smaller flame so as not to scorch the roots. You added water in slow measures, watching the color shift from pale to gold, and let the mixture rest before straining it through a cloth. Tefra found a wooden cup with no chips and placed it near the fire to warm, and by the time you poured the broth in, the scent had become something almost medicinal, but not unpleasant. You carried it to the door yourself, handed it off to the boy with instructions to serve it warm, and let the cloth steep a while longer if the aide's stomach turned. The boy nodded, wide-eyed, and you wondered if he would remember the way your voice stayed level, the way your hands didn't tremble. When you returned to the hearth, the kitchen was quieter still. The others had begun to drift toward rest, and Henna had retreated to her small stool near the pantry, the one where she mended aprons with fingers that still moved swiftly despite the swelling in her knuckles. You saw Tefra sitting near the fire again, a thread in her hand, slowly sewing the frayed edge of her shawl. You sat beside her, without speaking, pulled your legs beneath you, and let the fire's warmth move into your bones. She asked, after a long silence, if you ever felt that this place, this kitchen, these stones, had begun to know you, not as a body to labor, but as a person, a presence. You considered it, let the thought stretch itself through your memory. You told her you sometimes imagined that the hearth remembered the touch of your hands, that the floor knew your step, and the soot in the corners had caught bits of your breath and held them. That maybe every place we work hard enough into knows us back, just a little. Tefra nodded slowly, her eyes watching the flame. She said she had started talking to the walls when she first arrived, quiet things, names of people she missed, songs she couldn't finish, and that sometimes she thought the walls whispered back, not in words, but in warmth. You didn't laugh. You understood, deeply, in ways you didn't yet know how to explain. You sat like that until the fire burned low and the last lantern was snuffed. The stew pot, emptied and scrubbed, sat cooling beside the hearth, its lid resting slightly ajar. The scent of apples still lingered in the air, mingling with the herbal sharpness of the broth and the ever-present trace of smoke. As you both moved toward your palates, the kitchen dim and full of breath, you felt that same sensation again, the one that had begun as a whisper but now moved more boldly within you. Not safety, not certainty, but the slow, quiet building of something like home. Not the home of your youth, where songs were sung and stories told, where arms reached for you in sleep and doors opened onto fields, but a different kind of home, born not of blood or comfort, but of presence, of labor shared, of silence held together, of knowing someone was there, still breathing, still beside you, even when the words fell away. That night, you fell asleep without fear. The snow had stilled, the fire remained, and the kitchen, in its slow and steady way, held you. The thaw did not come suddenly. It crept in the way age does, slowly and without announcement, weaving itself into the edges of things until the change became undeniable. You noticed it first, not in the air, but in the way the snow no longer held its shape beneath your boot,
turning instead to slush with the weight of each step. The icicles along the eaves had grown thinner, their tips weeping into rivulets that followed the seams of stone and vanished into the earth. The cold still clung to the mornings, sharp and impatient. But by the time the second bell rang, the kitchen had begun to sweat. You pulled your sleeves up instinctively, your arms still pale beneath the soot and scars of winter's work, and moved through the room with the quiet sense that something had shifted, something subtle and slow but irreversible. Tefra was humming that morning, not a song you recognized, and not loudly, but enough that it curled around your ears as you chopped the last of the winter turnips into coins. Her voice moved like water over gravel, soft and uneven, and you let it carry you through the silence between the usual sounds. The rhythm of chopping, of ladling, of the fire huffing beneath the pot, all of it folded around her hum like a cloth around bread. Henna noticed it too. She looked up once from where she was sealing a sack of flour and narrowed her eyes slightly, but said nothing. Perhaps she had come to understand that sound was not always defiant. Sometimes it was healing. By midday, the courtyard had become a patchwork of grey and brown, the snow breaking apart into wet channels that traced the steps of anyone who crossed. You went out to fetch a fresh bundle of firewood and returned with your boots soaked through and the smell of thawed earth clinging to your hem. The sky above had taken on a strange hue, not blue exactly, but the colour of linen after it had dried in the wind. You tilted your head to it, letting the breeze slip across your cheeks, and for a moment you felt lighter, like the winter that had burrowed into your bones was finally loosening its grip. The afternoon passed with the kind of quiet labour that no longer exhausted you. You had grown into the work like a vine against stone, bending around it, holding on, finding the cracks where your roots could take hold. You and Tefra moved in your usual orbit, speaking little, understanding much. At one point, as she stirred the stew, she leaned slightly against your shoulder and murmured that the warmth was beginning to return to her toes, and you laughed under your breath, nodding as if to say, "Yes, mine too." The joke was nothing, and yet it stayed with you longer than many of the days that came before. Henna pulled you aside after the supper trays had been lifted, her expression unreadable but not hard. She handed you a folded cloth and told you to take it to the steward's chamber, that he had requested a particular dish be prepared for the evening, something simple but served warm. You took the cloth without question, noting the grease-stained corners and the hurried writing on the inside, and left the kitchen through the smaller passage that led to the upper floors. The stone stairs were slick with meltwater in places, but your steps were careful now, practiced. You no longer moved like someone expecting to be corrected. You moved like someone who had learned to belong without permission. The steward's chamber was not what you expected. You had imagined tapestries and fire, but it was spare, cold, almost monkish in its simplicity. He took the cloth from your hands and asked you to wait while he read it, then nodded once, folding it again with a kind of tired precision. He did not speak to you like a servant. Not quite like an equal either, but his voice was measured, as though he understood that his words could land heavily if he wasn't careful. He asked if you knew how long you had been in the kitchen. You gave him the number of winters. He nodded again and said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice low enough that it felt almost misplaced, he told you that the bishop had noticed the quality of the meals lately, that your name and Tefra's had been spoken aloud in the context of improvement. You didn't know what to say, so you said nothing. He dismissed you shortly after, and you returned to the kitchen with the kind of silence that weighed differently on your chest. Tefra looked up when you re-entered, saw the expression on your face, and tilted her head. You shook yours in return, a silent answer that meant, not bad, not good, just strange. She nodded as though that was enough. The fire had burned low in your absence, but she had fed it again, and now it glowed deep and steady. The coals at the base were red as memory, and you both sat near them for a while, letting the warmth unknot the stiffness in your hands. You spoke only once, when you told her what the steward had said. Her expression was unreadable for a long moment, and then she asked if it changed anything. You said you didn't know. She said she wasn't sure either. Later, as the kitchen darkened and the last of the workers slipped away to their beds, Henna remained behind a few extra minutes. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She just walked the length of the room once, her eyes lingering on the pots, on the fresh loaf wrapped in cloth, on the embers in the hearth. She paused near your seat, nodded once and said simply, "We did well today. Not you, not I. We." Then she left without another word. You and Tefra curled into your blankets shortly after, your shoulders brushing beneath the covers. The room was quiet now, save for the faint crackle of coal and the slow breath of those around you. Outside, the snow continued its retreat, the edges of the world reappearing one stone at a time. You closed your eyes and let the warmth carry you forward, not into sleep, but into rest. The thaw did not bring noise with it. It came instead with a slow softening, like the loosening of fingers once clenched too long. The world, so long blanketed in white and silence, seemed to exhale at last, and with it came the trickle of water from gutters, the muffled squelch of mud beneath boots, and the gentle return of birdsong so thin it might have gone unnoticed if you hadn't been listening. But you were listening. You had begun, perhaps without realizing, to listen for things beyond the demands of work. It was not just the bell that marked time anymore, or the creak of the storeroom door, or the scrape of spoons in bowls. Now you heard the shift of light in the kitchen, the change in rhythm when Tefra walked versus when Henna did, the way the fire's breath changed in tempo depending on what it was being asked to warm. All of it had become part of the story you lived inside, each day written in heat and steam and motion, but also in stillness. You woke that morning before the first bell, drawn up from sleep not by any external stir, but by the pull of warmth against your cheek and the hum of voices near the hearth. Two of the boys had risen early to clean out the ash bin, and their whispers floated through the room like threads unraveling from a sleeve. You lay still, eyes half open, and watched the orange flicker play along the ceiling, the scent of ash and damp wool thick in the air. Tefra was still asleep beside you, her brow smooth in the soft light, one hand resting lightly on her chest as though she held something precious there. You turned away gently, not wishing to disturb her, and sat up, pulling the blanket around your shoulders before making your way to the fire. The boys stilled when they saw you, their eyes wide for a moment before you nodded once and reached for the kettle. They returned to their task, more comfortable now, and you added kindling to the hearth without speaking. The morning built slowly. The bread was simple again, barley and the last of the dried onion, kneaded with care and baked with less steam to keep the crust firm. The stew was root-heavy, thick with lentils and softened carrots, stretched with a bone broth that had simmered low the day before. There was a rhythm to it now that felt second nature, as though your hands knew the next motion before your mind caught up. Tefra joined you at the basin, her sleeves rolled and hair plaited back, and she washed the turnips while you peeled. The water was colder than usual, the barrels outside not yet fully warmed by the sun, and your fingers ached after only a few minutes submerged. But neither of you complained. You had learned by now that some discomfort was not worth the air it took to name. Henna seemed quieter that day, not in mood, but in presence. She moved through the kitchen with a kind of gentle gravity, her eyes not missing a thing, yet her voice barely rising above a murmur. She corrected one of the boys who salted the stew too early and adjusted the logs beneath the oven when the fire grew too hot, but she did so with the same ease one might use to straighten a chair or close a window. There was no tension in her shoulders, no steel in her spine, just a quietness that matched the morning. She passed you once while you were stacking bowls and placed a hand briefly on your shoulder. Not to steady you, not to command, just to connect. It lingered long enough to be felt, and then was gone. As the day carried on, you found yourself moving more slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of intention. You noticed how the light pulled differently near the herb shelf, how the smell of thyme lingered longer when the windows were open, just a crack. You noticed how Tefra's fingers danced slightly when she stirred the pot, as if she was playing an invisible instrument. You noticed how even the soot along the edge of the hearth had begun to flake, loosened by the shift in air and the warming of stone. And you began to wonder if the kitchen, like you, was preparing to change again. After the meal service, with most of the trays returned and the bowls scraped clean, Tefra invited you to walk outside with her. It was not a request she had made before, and you accepted without hesitation, setting your cloth aside and following her through the side door that led to the small kitchen garden. The ground was soft beneath your feet, the snow no longer clinging but retreating in patches that revealed the muddied earth below. The air was sharp still, but not biting. You both stood beneath the narrow archway for a moment before stepping out into the slush, your boots leaving ants that quickly filled with water. Tefra knelt near the herb bed, brushing her fingers gently over the damp soil where new green had just begun to show. She didn't speak, and neither did you. The quiet between you was comfortable, shaped by long hours shared over fire and flour. She looked up after a while and said that the soil would be ready soon, that maybe this year they could grow more than rosemary and mint, that maybe they could try cabbage or even beets if the steward allowed. You smiled and said you would help her turn the beds when it was time, and that small promise settled between you like a seed tucked into warm earth. You returned to the kitchen just before the bell rang for supper preparation. The fire had dimmed slightly, and you fed it with a few dry sticks while Tefra pulled the loaves from the oven. The scent of bread spread into the rafters, filling every corner like a benediction. Henna passed you the list for evening meal, simple again, though more generous than it had been for weeks. A hint, perhaps, of resources returning, or of someone above choosing not to count quite so strictly. You prepared the plates with Tefra, your hands moving in time with hers, and when the steward arrived to collect them, he gave you a nod that was almost a bow. That night, as the kitchen settled into its quiet, you sat near the fire with Tefra, the blanket draped across both your legs, your hands curled around a shared cup of broth. The flames cracked softly, casting flickers across the stone floor, and the scent of bread lingered in the air.
You didn't speak of tomorrow, nor of what might come after. You simply sat together, wrapped in the warmth of what had been built day by day, fire by fire, quiet by quiet. When you lay down to sleep, your head resting near the hearth and your body curled toward its heat, you listened to the soft breath of those around you and felt the shape of the kitchen settle around you like an old familiar garment. The world outside was changing, yes, but here, for now, was steadiness. And as the fire glowed red behind your closed eyes, you let yourself drift, carried not by fear, but by the hush of a life that had become something like peace. Morning came softer this time, not with the insistence of cold or the clamour of bells, but with a slow amber light that filtered through the shutters and spilled across the stone floor like a quiet welcome. You stirred beneath the weight of your blanket, warmth pooled around your legs, and the scent of bread, faint and distant, hinted that someone else had risen before you. There was no urgency in your limbs as you moved, no cold shock as your feet found the floor. The fire had not died overnight. It was not a blazing heat, but a steady one, coals glowing like old memories, holding the room in a quiet hush that asked for nothing more than to be noticed. You sat for a moment before rising, watching the dance of light across the ceiling, the hush of morning, allowing the sounds of the world beyond the stone to filter in more clearly than usual. Birds, for the first time in weeks, their calls uncertain, cautious, but real. Tefra was already at the table, her back to the door, slicing the ends from a pile of carrots, the knife steady in her hand. She didn't turn when you entered, but smiled when she heard your steps. And something about that small act made your chest ache in the softest way. You joined her without speaking, taking the second blade from its place and beginning on the pile of onions she had set beside the bowl. The silence between you was the kind born of closeness, not distance, a silence that had come to mean many things over the months: acceptance, companionship, peace. And beneath all of that, trust, the kind that didn't need to be named aloud to be felt. Henna entered after the second bell, her shawl pulled close and her gait slower than usual. The thaw had not been kind to her joints, and the damp crept into the places that already ached. Still, she made no comment, just moved to the hearth, stirred the fire with the iron rod, and stood there a moment with her eyes closed, letting the heat sink into her bones. She opened them only after the stew pot had begun to bubble again, and her first words were a gruff observation that the carrots had been sliced well. Tefra gave a quiet hum in reply, and you said nothing, your hands still working, your shoulders loose with the ease of a day beginning in rhythm. By midday, the courtyard outside had become a mixture of brown earth and stubborn patches of snow, but the air had changed. It no longer bit at your skin, it brushed it. Gentle, still cool, but not unfriendly. You were sent to fetch herbs again, this time with one of the younger boys, and as you walked through the narrow corridor that led to the outer cloister, he asked if the kitchen always smelled like this, like warm stone and thyme and something sweet that he couldn't name. You told him it often did, though it had taken time to learn how to make it so. He asked if you thought the bishop ever noticed. You paused before answering. Maybe not directly, you said, but in his quietest moments, when the day ended and the tray was set before him, he probably felt it. The way one feels a kindness they cannot quite place. That seemed to satisfy the boy, who walked a little taller after that. The garden was no longer buried. You found green shoots where before there had been only frost-burnt stalks. The rosemary clung on. The mint was already bold, curling upward,
as if trying to meet the sun. You gathered what Henna had requested, but you did it slowly, your hands brushing the soil with care, your thoughts trailing into the spaces left by winter. You thought of your first days here, of the hunger and the cold and the weight of silence that had once settled like a stone behind your ribs. And now, kneeling in thawed earth with the sun warming the crown of your head, you thought of how that silence had changed. It had become something you carried differently. Not absence, but openness. You returned to the kitchen with the bundle of herbs in hand and passed them to Tefra, who began stripping the leaves without instruction. Her fingers moved faster now, surer. The other workers gave her space without needing to be asked. She had grown into her place the way ivy grows up stone, not loudly, not with show, but with a steady quiet that reshaped the wall without ever breaking it. Henna passed by her once and rested a hand briefly at the base of her neck, a gesture so small you might have missed it if you weren't watching, but one that held years in it. The supper trays that night were simple but generous. Henna had found an extra round of cheese in the larder and a small jar of honey that had been tucked behind the vinegar. The bread was soft this time, full of egg and oil, and the stew was rich with the meat of the last salted pork. You and Tefra prepared the bowls together, arranging each slice of bread with care, brushing the crust with the barest touch of honey so it would catch the firelight when served. When the steward came, he said nothing at first, only lifted the tray and stared at it for a moment longer than usual. Then he nodded and said it looked like a meal meant to be remembered. Henna didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened, and when she turned back to you, she offered something rare. Thank you. Quiet. Whole. Meant. The evening wound down slowly, the last clatter of spoons replaced by the soft scrape of chairs and the gentle creak of the old stool near the hearth. You and Tefra sat there again, your legs tucked beneath you, the fire warming your toes through worn leather. She leaned her head against your shoulder without asking, and you leaned into her in return, and for a long time you said nothing. The room was warm and the walls no longer felt like stone. They felt like something lived in, softened by breath and memory. You thought of all the hours, all the days, all the small movements that had brought you here. Not just to this place, but to this peace. Hard, won, yes, uneven, but yours. When sleep finally pulled at your limbs, you moved to your blanket with a slow stretch, Tefra's fingers trailing from your sleeve until you were just out of reach. You curled toward the fire as you always did, and she curled behind you, her breath a steady rhythm against your spine. Around you, the others had settled, and above, the wind had stilled. There would be more work tomorrow. There would always be work. But for tonight, the fire still glowed, the air smelled of bread, and in the quiet between the bells, you belonged.